Sound check February 28th, GIC. Sound check February 28th, GIC. Sound check February 28th, GIC.
Quorum is present, and I'd like to call this meeting to order. Members of the public are advised that our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and temporarily archived on the city's website. As well, a reminder that all electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings. Members are reminded of the 5-minute time limit, which will be adhered to during this meeting. And members can always submit a second time or another time to request to speak if you have more questions or comments to make. First up is approval of the agenda. Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
No, Madam Deputy Mayor, there is no changes to the agenda.
Thank you so much. So could I get a mover and seconder to approve the agenda as presented? Moved by Councillor Huang, seconded by Councillor Danko. Thank you. And electronic vote for those who can, otherwise indicate. That's affirmative for Councillor M. Wilson, Councillor Jackson, and myself.
Councillor Francis, we need your vote.
Councillor Francis is at the beach. And that carries. Thank you all. So next up is 4.1, Hamilton Water Standard of Care and Due Diligence Training. We have Director of Hamilton Water, Nick Winter, Senior Regulatory Coordinator, Wendy Jackson, and Manager of Compliance and Regulations, Susan Gert, and they will take us through the presentation.
Madam Deputy Mayor, we missed asking if there's any declarations of interest.
Oh, my apologies. Before our wonderful staff take us through their presentation, any declarations of interest, either disqualifying or non-disqualifying? I see no indication on the virtual screen in front of me. I can't see at the council chambers.
There are none being declared in the council chambers.
Thank you. And so we'll proceed now. Thank you to 4.1.
There we go. Now you're sharing the notes, so we want to do that again. There we go. We're ready to go. Good morning, Mayor Horwath, members of council. Welcome to this morning's training session. For those watching at home, Nick Winters, Director of Hamilton Water. The purpose of the training today is to help you all understand the legislated responsibilities that accompany your roles as the owners of the city's water and wastewater and stormwater systems. Standard of care training is a requirement to be taken by the owner of the drinking water systems, but Hamilton has continued to be proactive in going beyond compliance, so we've included materials today on the city's wastewater and stormwater systems as well. In addition, for your awareness, this is the exact same training that is provided to the Public Works General Manager and all Hamilton Water senior staff, as we are the operating authority for these municipal systems, as you're going to hear about this morning. Carlisle and myself also have responsibilities as top management for our quality management systems within Hamilton Water. Carlisle is not with us today. We have Angela Story, who's acting General Manager for Public Works while he's away on vacation. For those members of council that have received this training previously, I do hope that this session today is a helpful refresher for you. I know that I always learn something new every time I go through it as well. And finally, the presentation today is split into two separate sections. First, we're going to talk about drinking water, and then we'll talk about wastewater and stormwater. And at the end of each of those sections, we'll pause and provide time for questions and answers. I did want to mention that we provided some supporting documents for today's presentation. One of those materials is a cheat sheet of acronyms that are used throughout the presentation. We were talking earlier, unfortunately in the water wastewater industry, acronyms are unavoidable. But we can't spell every one of them out on the presentation slides because there just isn't room. So we hope that those materials are helpful for you. The second document is the standard of care guide for municipal councils that was prepared by the province of Ontario back in 2014. And it is a very helpful resource for anyone who hasn't had an opportunity to read that yet. So I get the pleasure of introducing the presenters for today's training. Along with myself, we have Susan Gert. Susan is online. She's got a bit of a cold, so she's doing the responsible thing and staying at home today. Susan is Hamilton Water's Manager of Compliance and Regulations, and as part of her responsibilities, she is also the Systems Management Representative for our quality management systems. With me at the podium is Wendy Jackson, Hamilton Water Senior Regulatory Coordinator, and she is the leader of our compliance support team. Also online, we have Carmen Vega. She is our Senior Project Manager of Source Water Planning, and she is also the city's risk management official under the Clean Water Act. And then finally, at the bench, we have Lee Veritas. Lee is our Project Manager of Compliance Support. She won't be presenting this morning, but it's her first time participating in this training with council, so she will be soaking it all in. And she also did the majority of the work to get the materials for the session put together. So thank you very much, Lee. Okay, so here's the agenda for this morning. We do intend to have everyone out of here by noon, we're hopeful, although we'll certainly stick around and answer as many questions as we get. The standard of care provisions within the Provincial Safe Drinking Water Act require that the Mayor and Council, as drinking water system owners, be informed, ask questions, and get answers. The Mayor and Councillors receive that information from Hamilton Water as the city's operating authority. And you address questions to us and any external experts that we engage. It's our duty to be open and honest with our municipal drinking water system, wastewater, stormwater system owners, and to provide answers to the questions that you have. So without further ado, we're going to jump into the standard of care training for the drinking water system. So this slide provides the high-level purpose of the standard of care training. Safe drinking water, as you're all aware, is one of the key pillars of public health in Ontario, and protection of our drinking water is a vital responsibility shared by many partners. As municipal councillors with oversight responsibilities for municipal drinking water systems, you're a critical partner in providing safe drinking water to the people of Hamilton. This training will help you understand your responsibilities under the Safe Drinking Water Act and provide you with information on how Ontario's and Hamilton's drinking water is protected. It will help answer questions about your statutory standard of care responsibilities, and it provides some basic reference material on drinking water. And now I'm going to pass things over to Susan Gert, who's going to present the next several slides.
Thank you very much, Nick. Can everybody hear me? Okay, thank you. I got the thumbs up. So good morning, everybody. The Safe Drinking Water Act and the Drinking Water Quality Management Standard identify the responsibilities for certain positions. These next couple of slides are going to help you know who has these roles in Hamilton, and Nick alluded to a couple already. So the owner of the Hamilton drinking water systems is Mayor and Council. The operating authority for the large and the small municipal residential drinking water systems is Hamilton Water, as Nick mentioned. Myself, as the Manager of Compliance and Regulations, is the System Management Rep, and that means that I have to make sure that everything is available to our staff, completed on time, reports are submitted, top management is held. You'll find out more about that from Wendy a little later on. And then Nick mentioned that top management for the drinking water quality management system is the General Manager, Carlisle, and himself as the Director of Hamilton Water. So key external parties include public health services, who may direct us to take specific actions during adverse water quality incidents. Hamilton Water is proactive and meets biannually with public health to provide them with awareness of projects that are being undertaken and the status of the system, and to review the memorandum of understanding that we have with them that guides us during communications and actions if we have an adverse. The Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks is the legal authority who oversees compliance to the legislation through the issuance of permits and licenses and permits to take water and their annual drinking water system inspections. They are also the author of the Drinking Water Quality Management Standard related to conformance, and they approve the accreditation bodies who can accredit the municipalities' drinking water quality management system. For the City of Hamilton, the accreditation body is Intertech SAI Global. They just got bought out, so that's the latest. So what are these drinking water systems that the owner is responsible for and that the operating authority is to manage? In Hamilton, we have one lake-based municipal residential system, and that's the Woodward system, along with the subsystem of 50 Road, and 4 well-based municipal residential systems. All of these systems are accredited under the Drinking Water Quality Management System. While the mayor and council are the owner of the 5 municipal residential drinking water systems operated by Hamilton Water, mayor and council are also the owner of small non-residential or designated drinking water systems located across Hamilton, where Hamilton Water is not the operating authority. These systems are not included in the Drinking Water Quality Management System or are the responsibility of Hamilton Water, but the owner, mayor and council, has responsibilities in the legislation and should make themselves familiar with the other operating authorities within the City of Hamilton. A new addition to this is the Red Hill Family Center Nursery. They act as the operating authority, and if there are any adverse water quality incidents, the lab calls them directly. For the others, facilities is the contact, and you should follow up with them on that. The next slide talks about Section 11 of the Safe Drinking Water Act, and it's where it states that the owners and operators are responsible for ensuring that the drinking water systems, 1, provide water that meets all prescribed drinking water quality standards, 2, operates in accordance with the Act and its regulations and are kept in a fit state of repair, 3, are appropriately staffed and supervised by qualified persons, 4, complies with all sampling, testing, and monitoring requirements, and 5, meets all the reporting requirements. It's Section 19 that legalizes these requirements by reinforcing that the owners and operators must exercise the level of care, diligence, and skill that a reasonably prudent person would be expected to exercise and to act honestly, competently, and with integrity. This does not mean that mayor and council are the subject matter experts. The Act does allow that the owner can rely on technical experts, whether they are in Hamilton Water or the operating authority, or other persons with the appropriate professional qualifications. And I'd like to hand the presentation over to Wendy Jackson now.
Thank you, Susan. The protections we have in place today in Ontario are the direct result of the tragic loss of life and illness due to a water quality incident in Walkerton, Ontario, over 20 years ago. An incident where there was E. coli contamination of the community's water supply, an incident where there were many things that went wrong and many failures and deficiencies. The protections that we have in place today came about by addressing the Walkerton incident failures. So we do have a short video to show, and this is a first-hand account of the impacts to the municipality of Walkerton, the financial, reputational, as well as trust and the human health impacts to the citizens following the tragedy. This presenter, his name is Bruce Davidson, and at the time he was a spokesperson for the concerned Walkerton citizens, and he went around to a number of municipalities and had speaking engagements in 2009 and 2010, which is important to remember because we're going to show some financial numbers that are way back when, so it's important to realize that. And his presentation was called "The Cost of Getting It Wrong." And this video is a collection of excerpts that we thought would be of interest. So I'm going to hand it over to Reese, who will make this video go.
And a little girl who the weekend before, on the Mother's Day weekend, shortly after the heavy rains, attended a restaurant in Walkerton with her family. And that little girl didn't even live in Walkerton. This little girl was not yet 2 years old. She drank 1 glass of water and became seriously ill. As the illness progressed and became more and more threatening to her life, without knowing what they were dealing with, my understanding is she was given antibiotics, which killed everything in her system, including the E. coli, releasing a toxin which caused that little girl to have a stroke and die a few days later. 1 glass of water. You cannot see, taste, or smell the amount of E. coli that would be required in a glass of water to make you seriously ill or take your life. Think about the responsibility that you have, because the citizens that you provide water for can't use their senses in those cases to tell them that anything is wrong with the water. A little toddler 2 doors down from us whose kidneys went into failure. It took the entire summer and incredible medical intervention to save that boy's life. He will have to be monitored for the rest of his life. A young boy at the end of the street, a young teenager at the time, who was typical of many of the people in Walkerton. You may have had an underlying condition that was completely well managed, but under these circumstances, the E. coli contamination was enough to push you over the edge and threaten your life. This boy, from the time he was very young, suffered with a problem where he was producing excess cerebral fluid, pressuring his brain. So a shunt was placed in to drain this fluid into his abdomen. My understanding is that that shunt very quickly plugged with bacteria, and he was rushed away in critical condition. The gentleman's name is Jeff Holliday, and Jeff, like many people in town, had a manageable condition before the water. He was an active diabetic, very active guy in our community. The E. coli tragedy cost Jeff both kidneys and his pancreas. He came to speak to us in 2005 at a conference like this where we had post-grad students in the study of public health and the management of water. And he came into a room just like this, holding hands with his mom. He wasn't holding hands with his mom because he loves her. He was holding hands with her because when he comes from the sunlight into a room like this, he was virtually blind because of the blood clots behind his eyes. Jeff told us about how every day started with a plate full of pills to keep him alive, and how he was literally wasting away, unable to work, waiting for a transplant. What are the costs of getting it wrong? Post-traumatic stress in our community, about 15% of the population suffering that. That's like being in a war zone. You can't run from it. It can lead to health consequences, pain throughout the body, social situations of family abuse, substance abuse. It's a very, very negative scenario. Loss of business to other communities. When you become the pariah of water and there's a bigger town down the road, guess where they're gone? Our municipal insurance tripled. What would happen to any of your towns if the municipal insurance budget went up by 3 times? What would you do? Cuts to MOE, about $40 million at the time. Cost of Walkerton tragedy will be over $150 million for a town of 5,000 people. And I'll talk about illness in a minute. This is a slide that some of you might want to grab a copy of that was commissioned by the Walkerton Inquiry by Justice O'Connor, and these numbers have gone up dramatically. Anybody got $4 million for emergency water? $9 million to redo the plumbing in their town? Coroner visits, it goes on and on. 64 million plus at that time. Look at the long-term health costs of about $2.5 million. There are 2 people in Walkerton I can name who will each cost more than $2.5 million in their lifetime for the 2 of them. And then there's the class action settlements, which are not accounted for in this. Is it worth it to do the job right the first time? Even if you don't care about anything else, economically, it makes no sense.
and talk about acronyms, they threw in an acronym there, the MOE. It's gone through various rebranding over the time, so now it's Municipal Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. So, thank you. I've seen that video dozens of times, and it still chokes me up every time. Okay, moving on to some legislation. So following the tragedy, the inquiry that was led by Justice Dennis O'Connor, who was mentioned in that clip, there were 121 recommendations shown in these 8 areas that are shown on the slide. This inquiry found that there was not one failure, therefore there's not one fix. These recommendations, they touch every aspect of the delivery of safe drinking water. I'll highlight a few of these in the next coming slides. So this graphic shows the progression of legislation in Ontario from minimal pre-Walkerton legislation to immediate post-Walkerton changes and fixes to the comprehensive post-inquiry legislation that we have in today. So this legislation grew in volume, complexity, as well as comprehensiveness. In Ontario now, we have an integrated system of procedures, processes, and tools that collectively prevent or reduce the risk of contamination in the drinking water, all in the effort to protect public health. The multiple barriers include water treatment barriers, so that means keeping our sources of drinking water, our lakes and rivers and groundwaters protected, and by reducing potential contamination. And also looking ahead to make sure that our raw water sources are available and viable in the future. Controls for water treatment and our distribution systems to remove or control hazards. The controls include system-specific controls that were determined through engineering reports. There's also sampling and testing and monitoring to detect and act on any problems. The legislative barriers, there are 2 overarching pieces of legislation, the Clean Water Act, which protects the source water, as well as the Safe Drinking Water Act, which I'll get into more detail. There are also institutional barriers, legislative requirements for owners, operating authorities, and the operators of our treatment and distribution systems. And the Swiss cheese analogy is a good one to use, in that if you line up the pieces of the cheese, you will have you won't have a hole going straight through. So one of those barriers is bound to protect. So we like that that visual. Another visual, this is a graphical depiction of the multiple barriers, and it's a take-home visual of what those barriers look like, showing snapshots from our City of Hamilton drinking water systems and our people. So the centerpiece of our legislation is the Safe Drinking Water Act, and it is in place for the protection of human health and the prevention of drinking water health hazards. This is the list, or all the things that we didn't have before Walkerton. And the key to the Safe Drinking Water Act is the standard of care, which is why you're here today, and which extends the legal responsibility to people with the ultimate decision-making authority over municipal drinking water systems. And for us in the City of Hamilton, that is Mayor and Council. This timeline shows the key legislative changes in Ontario since the Walkerton tragedy in 2000, starting with the creation of the Safe Drinking Water Act 2 years later, and the requirements for standard of care, which came into effect 12 years later. Given the extent of the changes and the overhaul in the legislation, this did not happen overnight. This timeline also shows the City of Hamilton's journey, including our key milestones. So in 2003, and this is one is of note because we did it well ahead of the legislative requirement, was the licensing of our environmental laboratory. In 2008, we had Council's first endorsement of our DWQMS, our Drinking Water Quality Management System Operational Plan, which is this. I brought this here for everyone. So this is our operational plan. So that was approved and endorsed in 2008. and in 2010, Council's first endorsement of the financial plan, and our huge milestone in 2011, the first DWQMS accreditation, which Susan will talk about in an upcoming slide. The next two slides provide an overview of the regulations under the Safe Drinking Water Act, their purpose related to deficiencies identified in the Walkerton inquiry. The regulations on this page relate primarily to water treatment and the institutional barriers mentioned earlier. Highlighted here are OREG 170.03, which is the operational checks for sampling, testing, and monitoring. OREG 169.03, which is our drinking water quality standards and limits, and OREG 128.04, which is the certification requirements for our operators. These are all integral to how we as a municipal operating authority, these govern our day-to-day operations. Continue with the Safe Drinking Water Act. The first pieces of legislation shown here are licensing, drinking water testing, and the financial plan. And these tie back to the institutional barriers mentioned in the earlier slide and the system milestones shown in the previous timeline. There's one last one that Susan mentioned, which is the Health Protection and Promotion Act. It's a separate act which is applicable to those small drinking water systems and is governed by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. And these ones are not looked after by Hamilton Water, but Susan will be talking about that. A further breakdown of OREG 170, which is the requirements for municipal, residential, and non-residential drinking water systems for water quality monitoring, testing, and reporting of water quality results. You'll see that in this regulation there are requirements for annual reporting. These reports, you will soon see that they will be presented to the Public Works Committee on March 22nd and to Council on March 29th. The sister legislation to the Safe Drinking Water Act is the Clean Water Act. Thinking back to the multi-barrier approach, the purpose of the Clean Water Act is for the protection of existing and future sources of groundwater. Compliance to these requirements is managed by Hamilton Water's Watershed Management Group. Lastly, one other key piece of legislation that includes requirements for the owners and operating authorities of municipal infrastructure is the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act 2015 and its Regulation 588-17, which is asset management planning for municipal infrastructure. As you may already be aware, this regulation sets out requirements for municipalities to have a policy and a plan for municipal asset management. Shown in this table are a few of the major milestones, and want to highlight that we met the deadline to have our policy in place, and we are working on the implementation plan phases. This work is led by Public Works Asset Management Team, working with Hamilton Water as an asset owner. And I think it's back to Susan.
Yes, thank you, Wendy. So standard of care is a well-known concept within Ontario regulation. Statutory standards of care address the need to provide diligent oversight. There are three key points that the owner should follow. One, it's your duty to act as required by the standard of care, as there are legal consequences. Two, to be informed. You don't have to be an expert in drinking water operations, but you need to be informed. Review the information provided to you by Hamilton Water and ask lots of questions. Be vigilant. Never take drinking water safety for granted or assume all is well with the drinking water under your care and direction. The health of our community depends on your diligent and prudent oversight of the drinking water system. When decisions come before council relating to drinking water, the mayor and council want to understand the impacts on the community and public health. Questions you might want to ask are we meeting our legislative and regulatory requirements? Who and how are we managing our drinking water infrastructure? Are there any areas of risk that council needs to address? And what are the risks to public health? Mayor and council also have an important role to play in ensuring that the appropriate resources are made available, including resources to ensure that a financial plan is prepared and approved. The approved financial plan is submitted with the renewal applications for our municipal drinking water licenses every 5 years, and you will be seeing that come to you later this year, as our licenses are all due in 2024. But the requirement is to make the applications to the ministry in November of this year. And then Hamilton Water, as the operating authority, is responsible for the continued accreditation of the drinking water quality management system and use of an accredited testing laboratory. We have the very good fortune of having our own in-house City of Hamilton environmental laboratory. Hamilton Water is also responsible for maintaining all appropriate licenses, permits, and permits to take water on behalf of the city and submit all required reports to the legislative bodies, all while keeping you informed. And Wendy, it's back to you.
Thanks, Susan. This is a visual of the legislative framework as a municipal operating authority. We must meet all the legislative requirements shown in the 5 blue circles. All must be in place in order to obtain and maintain our municipal drinking water system license. The majority of the requirements come from the Safe Drinking Water Act, as well as one requirement from the Ontario Water Resources Act, and that is related to our permit to take water. The 3 items shown in the circles on the top of the graphic are the permit to take water, which governs the quantities and rates for drawing raw water. The Drinking Water Works permit, which is basically like a building permit that describes our physical works, our physical systems, as well as sets in place the requirements when we want to make a change to those systems. And the financial plan, which is in place to ensure financial viability for our systems. The items in the bottom 2 circles, the operational plan, is as per the DWQMS standard. And last but not least, the DWQMS accreditation, which Susan will get into in the following slide. Our license is very similar to a driver's license in that it has an expiration date every 5 years, and it must be renewed prior to expiration. The requirement for the financial plans also comes from the Safe Drinking Water Act under OREG 45307. And going back to the previous timeline, ours in the City of Hamilton was first endorsed in 2008, and we continue with the cycle of updating and endorsing the financial plan. The financial plan is prepared by Hamilton Water's Capital Systems and Planning Group. So this is the DWQMS standard, and this standard was developed by the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, and it is based on the Quality Management System Standard of ISO 9001, and the management system standard used in the food industry, the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point Standard, also known as HACCP. And the ministry tied these 2 management system standards together to come up with our unique Made in Ontario DWQMS. So shown in the graphic are all the elements of the Made in Ontario DWQMS standard. These elements of the standard are organized around principles common to all management systems, which is Plan, Do, Check, Act. The requirements of the DWQMS, when implemented, will assist owners and operating authorities to develop sound operational procedures and controls. And the unique thing about this management system standard is that it was not voluntary. It was embedded in the legislation that we had to do it, which is unique to management system, other management systems. So this table shows the DWQMS elements, which I showed in the previous slide, listed as they relate to the Safe Drinking Water Act legislation post-Walkerton. So by having our DWQMS in place, we know that we have all the legislative requirements covered. Okay, back to you, Susan.
Thank you, Wendy. So as you mentioned, as part of the multi-barrier approach to protecting our drinking water, the ministry has required a MECP-approved registrar to accredit our drinking water quality management system and to audit it on a regular basis. For Hamilton, this is on a 3-year cycle. Years 2 and 3 are off-site document audits of select procedures and records. But every 3 years, a team of auditors conduct both the off-site document audit, but they also spend a couple of days auditing our operations in person across the drinking water systems, from the plant to the well stations to all the outstations. While the ministry annual inspections are assessing compliance to the legal requirements, the external auditors from the register are confirming our conformance to our drinking water quality management system, and whether we are doing what we say we do and have proof in accordance with the standard. Accreditation is the legal requirement of the licenses in order to operate the systems. So Wendy held up that binder of our operational plan. We have that online in our Intellex database so that all our Hamilton Water staff can have access to the documents. But element 1 of the standard and a binding document for the DWQMS is that operational plan. And you'll see the operational plan summary report coming to you in March. It pulls all the elements together for the operating authority's use and awareness. It includes basic information about the drinking water systems, a description of the roles and responsibilities and the authorities, and provides the framework for the internal and external audits. The DWQMS Operational Plan Summary Report is where both the owner and the operating authority sign the commitment and endorsement page to show awareness and acceptance of their responsibilities. A recommendation report, as I mentioned, will be asking for these signatures of the new mayor, council clerk, general manager, and director this March. Now, this page, the slide, shows the DWQMS SAFE policy. It's the backbone of the quality management system and was endorsed by council in 2008. It puts in writing for all to know what the key requirements are. So, delivery of safe, consistent supply of drinking water, continual improvement of our drinking water quality management system, following the legal requirements, and effective and efficient communication with our community. All operating staff receive DWQMS awareness training, along with essential suppliers and vendors. And this one is key. As Wendy mentioned earlier when she was describing the requirements of the standard, 2 of the elements noted on this slide are essential, as the results of these annual reviews are reported to the owner in the annual drinking water report. A risk assessment of the drinking water systems assesses existing and potential hazards and identifies controls that are in place or need to be developed. The results of the annual risk assessment are considered during the annual review of our infrastructure to determine next steps and budget needs. Having sustainable drinking water infrastructure is necessary to meet the demand for safe drinking water. Machinery, equipment, and structures used to produce and provide safe drinking water must be in place, maintained, and improved when necessary. Following the Deming cycle that Wendy mentioned of plan, do, check, and act, the annual internal audits address the check component. Objective auditors, who are trained Hamilton Water staff, audit the procedures, records, and operations of the drinking water systems on an annual basis. Findings are identified, root causes analyzed, and corrective and preventative actions are developed to correct, prevent, and improve the system. The audits also identify best management practices that can be shared. The auditor is always a fact finder and not a fault finder. The Act Improve component is addressed in the annual management review, where decisions are made on what changes are needed in order to improve the process. Continual improvement is the driving force behind the DWQMS standard. The owner will be made aware of the results of these processes in the annual drinking water report provided every March and in the budget presentations. Back over to you, Wendy.
Thank you. So given the number of regulatory requirements and conformance requirements and the size and complexity of our Hamilton drinking water system, we are very fortunate to have a QMS software tool. It is known as the Beyond Compliance Operating System Database, or the BCUS database. And we use the BCUS database to help manage our documents and records and help keep track of all those legal tasks. So this is the Ontario environmental legislation that we follow, so everything in there is in our BCUS database. As well, we manage our findings from audits, inspections, and incidents, which Susan mentioned audits previously. And I think this is me again. Yes, so in addition to our internal checks, including our internal audits, each of our drinking water systems are inspected annually by the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. Following the inspection, we are issued an inspection report where we may have inspection findings such as best management practices or recommendations or non-compliances. We are also given an inspection rating, which is scored out of 100. The inspection results, including those scores, feed into the annual report by the province's Chief Drinking Water Inspector. Shown on this slide are our inspection ratings from the inspection cycle spanning from 2001 to 2002. And I'll hand this over to Nick.
Thank you, Wendy. So the slide you see in front of you provides a definition of an adverse water quality incident, or AWQI, and it provides a trend for those adverse incidents across our 5 drinking water systems over the past 4 years. Ideally, we would like the number of AWQIs to be 0 every year, but that isn't the reality of operating a water utility. In addition to our inventory of continuous water quality monitoring analyzers, Hamilton Water staff collect 157 samples across our drinking water systems each and every month. It isn't uncommon for there to be a sample that shows either low chlorine levels, which have degraded below our requirements, and which triggers an operational response. A sample may also indicate the presence of some low levels of non-harmful bacteria, which prompt an investigation into system operation to see if there's anything to be concerned about. I can advise that the increasing trend of AWQIs that you see on this slide is caused by challenges with maintaining adequate chlorine levels in some areas of the drinking water system in the early fall when the water temperatures are at their peak, but lawn watering has mostly dropped off. A lot of work was done by Hamilton Water staff in 2022 to help manage this phenomena, and you can see that this work had an impact on the number of AWQIs. There was a significant decrease. We've also initiated studies aimed at identifying long-term options to manage or eliminate that challenge. The most important thing that I hope you can take away from this slide is that an AWQI doesn't mean that something drastically wrong is happening in the drinking water system. It's an indicator that something could be happening, which warrants additional investigation. At the same time, there's reporting to the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks and our partners in public health services. If additional sampling confirms that there's an issue in the system, then there's typically a simple corrective action required to restore water quality, including system flushing, additional sampling, and possibly other operations or maintenance interventions. On very rare occasions, situations are identified that require public notifications, and other water system interventions can include the issuance of a boil water advisory or a do not use drinking water advisory. And decisions for those types of interventions are made by the city's public health services team. And Wendy has the next slide.
So this table shows the reports and other documents which will come to Council annually or periodically. One way to demonstrate your standard of care is the receipt and review of these documents.
Back to me. This slide provides a snapshot of Hamilton Water's key performance indicator dashboard. Across our water, wastewater, and stormwater programs, we track 391 metrics or KPIs across a number of different areas, including service level provision, drinking water quality, treated wastewater quality, health and safety, financial performance, and others. These metrics and KPIs are reviewed monthly to determine whether corrective actions are required. And every year around this time, we look at the total performance from the previous year to evaluate the appropriateness of those key performance indicators and whether a continuous improvement project may be required in an area where we're continually challenged to meet a KPI. So I have two slides on our drinking water system challenges, or perceived challenges, that I'll try to move through quickly. For the Woodward subsystem, we fluoridate the city's drinking water. Now that isn't a challenge, but every once in a while we have seen certain segments of the population take issue with drinking water fluoridation based on misinformation that's easily accessible online. Interestingly enough, I read an article last week about residents in Buffalo, New York, that have launched a lawsuit against a water utility because they don't fluoridate the drinking water. And as everyone is likely aware, fluoridation is to assist with dental health within the community. Also in the Woodward subsystem, we add a corrosion inhibitor to the treated drinking water, which reacts with metals to form an insoluble precipitate. The orthophosphate inhibitor is completely safe for consumption, and it's aimed at specifically reducing community exposure to lead in drinking water from lead water service pipes, lead-containing plumbing fixtures, and other locations. Speaking of lead, for a number of years, Health Canada has been considering lowering the maximum acceptable concentration for lead in drinking water from 10 micrograms per litre to 5 micrograms per litre, which, should that ever happen, is not going to be a concern for our utility. This slide also speaks to our backflow prevention program, which includes a bylaw that requires industrial, commercial, and institutional properties to isolate their private plumbing systems from the city's drinking water system using an appropriate backflow prevention device. The challenge with this program is that we haven't been successful yet in getting all of the required backflow prevention devices installed through a voluntary process. So in the near future, we'll have to take a firmer stance, including provisions for enforcement of that bylaw. Historically, we've also been challenged to maintain storage of enough treated water in the community of Carlisle to meet minimum fire protection requirements. Attempts were made over several years to work with the community on a water conservation program to avoid the need for additional storage infrastructure in that community. But the necessary conservation targets proved impossible for the community to meet. And as a result, we're now in the midst of an environmental assessment that will look at the needs and options for that community's drinking water system. And finally, on this slide, there was a long-standing drinking water advisory for lead in the community of Linden's drinking water system. However, as a result of investments made in that community's drinking water treatment facility, along with enhanced operational programs, that drinking water advisory was able to be lifted in 2021. So there's some other challenges that we face, some of which are ever present and some that arise from time to time. That includes things like the potential for algae blooms to impact the drinking water intakes for the Woodward Wastewater Treatment Plant, and other climate-related scenarios, including extreme cold events that freeze water pipes, intense storms that stir up the lake and limit the production capacity at the water treatment plant, and elevated lake levels, which can lead to infrastructure damage. Other challenges identified in this slide include our drinking water system's inability to support all proposed development at any location in the city. Our historic challenges with underinvestment in renewal and replacement of infrastructure, future financial needs that will challenge the affordability of water for some of our ratepayers, and other difficult to control issues such as third-party contractors conducting work in our system without a licensed inspector on hand. And I'm going to pass things again over to you, Wendy.
Okay. So this graphic shows what has happened in other jurisdictions. So in 2014 in Flint, Michigan, there was a change to the source water, which exposed 100,000 residents to elevated levels of lead. So for us, this demonstrates why complacency is dangerous and a reminder to always be vigilant. So to wrap up this section of the training for our drinking water systems, a few key messages for you as mayor and members of council: to always be informed, ask questions, get your answers, and it is your duty. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nick for the question and answer.
Thank you, Wendy. So that was our last slide on the drinking water section of the presentation and standard of care. So we will pause here to address any questions that committee may have. I did want to again just bring your attention to one of the supporting documents that we provided, which is this one, which is the provincial guidance document on standard of care. It is a wealth of information on the topics that we've covered briefly here this morning, as well as other topics on water system operation.
Thank you, Director, and thank you, staff, for the overview and details in the presentation. You're certainly right. Every time I see it now, I pick up on different information as well. So can't say enough about our need to continue being exposed to this information so that we can all be better stewards. We do have a speakers list, so I just need a mover and seconder to receive the presentation. We won't vote at this time, just to open up the Q&A. Moved by Councillor Ted McMeekin, seconded by Councillor Spadafora. Thank you both. And first up on the speakers list, we have Councillor Maureen Wilson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. I just have a few questions, and then at the appropriate time on the agenda, just some parting comments about the cyclical nature of our concern in one generation, talking about the need to cut red tape and regulation, and then we lose our collective memory. We have a crisis, then we seem to strengthen our resolve, and this cycle continues. So I will have a question on that. And of course, as a proud chair, vice chair of public health prevents people from becoming patients, and it also saves a whole bunch of money. Walkerton cost, that tragedy cost that community $155 million, which in today's dollars would be $246 million. It cost, it affected real estate values. It cost a huge amount of money to correct their water system. They lost business revenues, and individual households and businesses having to expend money on bottled water. So I am interested, Chair Nan, if I could, through you. I think Director Winters made a reference to our lead protection and the federal government possibly changing our regulations in regard to that. And then he said he wasn't concerned about that. And I didn't really understand it. And I was wondering if he could please expand on that. Thank you.
Certainly, Director.
Absolutely. Through you, Chair Nan, to Councillor Wilson. So we have a robust lead control strategy for drinking water here in Hamilton that includes our orthophosphate-based inhibitor that we've been using since late 2018, as well as a lead service replacement program that's very active. It is an old system, and there is a significant amount of lead services remaining. But what we've seen through our regulated lead sampling over the years, as well as operational testing related to implementation of our corrosion control program, is that our corrosion inhibitor is performing very well. So every year we're required to conduct 2 rounds of sampling for lead, both within our distribution system, so from our fire hydrants, within residential plumbing. We collect 51 samples here in the Woodward distribution system annually, as well as in some industrial, commercial, institutional locations as well. And what we're seeing based on that annual water quality data is a decreasing exposure to lead in drinking water. I would mention that the the 5 micrograms per liter, which Health Canada is considering as a revised guideline, has been in place in the United States under the Environmental Protection Act for a number of years already. So we're well prepared to comply with that reduced limit should it come into place.
Councillor?
Thank you. A supplemental question on that. When Councillor Kazar and I were in receipt of a presentation on water sampling by Redeemer students, there was reference perhaps to the unintentional consequence of our lead program in increasing phosphorus outputs and the contribution or the detrimental consequences of that on natural habitat. And I was wondering within that realm if you could speak to that and the journey that's ahead of us on that. Thank you.
Certainly, through you, Chair Nan. So absolutely, there was a balancing act in controlling exposure to lead within the community versus having some additional phosphorus content in our drinking water that does make its way into the natural environment when there's water main breaks or when we're doing drinking water flushing or people watering lawns. The difference in concentrations at the tap are not significant, but when you add up the amount of water that does make its way out of our system and potentially into the natural environment, certainly pollutant loadings add up from phosphorus content. We've seen that at our wastewater treatment plant. In theory, every drop of water that residents or businesses within the city use would go down the tap into our wastewater treatment plant. So we've seen some increasing phosphorus loadings there. Over the past 5 years since the implementation of the orthophosphate control, and we've had to adjust our treatment process to deal with that. With regards to the exposure to the natural environment of the additional phosphorus loadings, that is something that is being explored under the City of Hamilton's Watershed Action Plan. I can tell you that the amount of phosphorus that's making its way into the environment is significantly dwarfed by the other sources of phosphorus within the community through runoff, particularly through fertilizers, both within the urban boundary and within agriculture. But it is something that's certainly being explored, talked about with our partners, including Redeemer University.
Thank you. I'm very glad to hear that it's on your radar. I'm not surprised. You're always on top of these things, Director, but it is assuring, but it is also troubling. Chair, I have one final question, and it's always moving to hear that tape from Mr. Davidson. And if I could, a little bit of latitude, because I'd like to read something further from him. He stated, "What happened in Walkerton took 20 years to develop. And if you chip away at the precautions and the protections that we put into place, then you are leaving yourself and your community vulnerable. And you're ignoring the information before you about those threats." So with that in mind, I would like, through you, to ask Director Winters, I did reference Bill 66, which is called Restoring Ontario's Competitiveness Act. It was an omnibus bill for my colleagues that covered 12 ministries. It was alleged to have purpose of which was to cut red tape and regulations for our competitiveness. And through you, I'm just looking for some assurance from Director Winters that when these omnibus bills roll across the province, that we're looking at them through a lens of prevention, and we'll be alerted of the some of the maybe consequences of them that could injure our collective well-being and health. Thank you, the Chair.
So through you, Chair Nan, I can say absolutely. Manager Gert, who's with us this morning, and Wendy, their group, one of the things they do is monitor incoming legislative changes or proposals on behalf of Hamilton Water and circle our wagons to provide comments and feedback in advance of those changes becoming law. We also work very closely with a number of industry associations across Ontario to harness our collective power within the province to push back against changes that we think, in our experience, would erode protections that are in place or just prevent barriers from us to provide the best potential or best possible value we can to the ratepayers here in Hamilton and in other communities for the water systems. It is our responsibility as the operating authority that should there be a legislative change that we believe creates a risk, to report that through to council, and we would do that.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair Nan. I raise this, of course, because immediately prior also to COVID arriving on scene, the province of Ontario was poised to cut all including our municipalities' public health budget. And they put a pause on that. And when the provincial government downloaded public health costs onto municipalities 20 or more years ago now, it resulted in program cuts. These cuts, this downloading, was identified as a major contributing factor by the public health inquiry into the Walkerton water crisis that killed 7 people and made 2,300 people ill. So I'm putting that on that. It doesn't have to be a political statement. It is a statement of fact. It is a statement of fact that we have to be diligent in watching for these ebbs and flows in legislation, which are often categorized as ways in which to make us competitive when they could, in fact, do the exact opposite. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Next up, we have Councillor Huang, please.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, to Director Winters. I do see on slide 23, there is a section that talks about the source protection plans. And I wonder if you could dig a little bit deeper into that, especially talk about our source protection plan, because I think about our lake and I think about our headwaters. So I wonder if you can elaborate more on what our Hamilton source protection plan looks like.
Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Chair. I certainly could, but whenever I can, I would prefer to let our experts speak to that. So we have Carmen Vega, who is, I mentioned it, our risk management official under the Clean Water Act and our senior project manager of source water planning on the line with us. I'd ask Carmen if she's willing to respond to that question.
Definitely. Good morning. I'll be happy to answer to the question. So through you, Chair Nan. And thank you for the question. Yes, we have a strong source water protection program within Hamilton. The area is divided within 3 source protection authorities. So each of these source protection authorities have their own source protection plan. These plans have been approved by the Ministry of Environment. So they contain policies that regulate activities within the wellhead protection area, so the areas around the municipal wells. And every time there is a certain development in the area or we notice certain activities in the area, we'll have to put in place certain measures.
So as follow-up through you, Chair Nan, to Carmen, who has the highest level of authority? So if let's say there is something shady that happens at any of our different locations, I suspect that the role of enforcement starts from our teams and then it moves upward. But who ultimately has the most amount of authority there?
Mm-hmm. Through you, Chair Nan, it's an interesting approach because we have precautionary role, first of all. So we want things to be managed before they become a threat to the drinking water source. Therefore, we have risk management plans for agricultural activities, for example, and there are inspections that we need to have in place with the owner of those properties. And depending of what we notice on the ground, for example, if there is a spill concern, the Ministry of Environment would get involved. If it's a matter of record keeping, then we'll have to follow up with the property owner, and we have certain legal authority to issue fines or to strengthen that inspection program. So far we have full collaboration with the property owners in that area, but yes, we have certain powers depending on what the issue is that we notice on the ground.
So, as follow-up through you, Chair Nan, to Carmen, just so if we have the authorities, like what's the normal protocol for, say, our residents to potentially notify? A lot of the times they'll notify the ward office first before they go forward. So what's that normal protocol look like?
It depends on the activity that is going on. A lot of residential related activity, there are not covered through these policies because it's considered that the amount of chemicals they may have on site would not have the potential to impact the municipal water sources. The policies talk mainly to the agricultural practices for our area. And the protocol typically is that, let's say if somebody notices an activity within the proximity of municipal wells, they will contact the city and probably they will contact the Ministry of Environment. If we are contacted, we would gather information on what's going on and follow up with a site visit.
Thank you. That was very fulsome. Thank you so much. My next question through you, Chair Nan, is probably to Director Winters, not sure, but I'd like to understand a little bit more about our emergency water plan. What happens in a catastrophic sort of scenario where, I don't know, somebody blows up our Woodward plant? What happens then? What does that look like?
So that's certainly a question for me through you, Chair Nan. Well, let's say I hope that never happens. We do have a emergency preparedness and response plan in place as part of our operational plan. It includes multiple levels of activation. So, for example, if there was a significant a concern in one of our drinking water systems, such as, more than a decade ago, we discovered lead in the Linden drinking water system that was coming from the source water. That led to a significant activation, but it was at a Hamilton Water level in concert with public health about investigating, figuring out exactly what was going on, what controls do we need to put in place to make sure that the community is safe. If there was a more significant disaster type event, such as, I might use the example of a chlorine release at the Woodward Water Treatment Plant, then we would, through our own emergency planning within Hamilton Water, reach out and activate or partially activate potentially the city's emergency operations center and through the city's emergency plans. And that would address really whatever the concern would be, whether it is evacuations, if there was a chlorine plume, for example, how would we mobilize drinking water if we ran into a supply issue because we were unable to treat? But there's a lot of interaction between Hamilton Water, the Public Works Departmental emergency plan, and then the city's emergency plan. Those plans are tested annually. We work very closely with the city's emergency operations team, and actually last year the training event that was completed was a chlorine release at the Woodward Water Treatment Plant. So all of our key staff are trained. We as Hamilton Water would have an incident commander working with the communications team to provide council with early notification about exactly what is going on and what the activation and controls that are being put into place look like. I wish we could say that we relied only on training with regards to emergency response, but there are things that come up from time to time that we do get to practice these things in real life too. So we've got a great team ready should something unfortunate happen. Let's knock on wood that it doesn't.
Councillor?
Thank you. That helps. Definitely when we've been recently hearing a lot about our emergency operations center and that sort of thing. I think I also want to understand just definitively, do we even have like a reservoir or something of clean drinking water should all systems fail and we have at least a backup sort of space?
So through you, Chair Nan, if we lost our water treatment plant, we'd be in trouble. Very quickly, but we do have the benefit in Hamilton. We have a lot of treated drinking water storage, a lot more than some of our peer municipalities, and which means that if all of our tanks were full and we ran into a major supply concern, during using regular volumes of drinking water within the community, we could probably have enough drinking water to keep the community supplied for about 2 days. In 2020, we issued the first ever mandatory water use restriction in the history of Hamilton due to some supply concerns at the water treatment plant. We saw that the community was extremely responsive to curtailing water use, which helped us out a lot during that time when we finished off a capital project and got the treatment facility back up to full production. So, I'm confident that given a normal operating capacity, that we would be able to get ourselves through a supply disruption. The only thing I would say, though, is that with the benefit of that amount of water storage in the system, it does lead to some other operational challenges, such as loss of chlorine residual, which I was speaking about earlier. If our reservoirs are full and people aren't using a lot of water, then we have to do something to turn that water over, or else the chlorine will decay, and that's particularly challenging when the drinking water is warm at the end of the summer or early fall. So there's always a balancing act.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you so much. And through you, Chair Nan, I have 2 more questions. You brought up comparison to other municipalities. So how does our water compare to other municipalities? I may be biased. I just think Hamilton water tastes way better, but that's just me, though.
Yeah, so through you, Chair Nan, I would echo that. I would say we have the best drinking water in Ontario. Now, it's been a while since we entered our water in a tasting competition. We are talking about it in the background, but that would be my very biased answer to that question as well. Certainly, we meet all of the regulatory requirements, and this community, I hope, is proud of the quality of the drinking water that is provided by our municipal systems.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you. And last question through you, Chair Nan. I'm always interested in innovation, and I know that I've had smaller conversations with you, Director Winters and GM Can. So through our sort of system, is there opportunities for additional innovation beyond what we're going to hear for the Dundas wastewater? But I'm also thinking about really cool things like sampling COVID in our wastewater. Are there any types of opportunities in that sort of vein that we can potentially leverage through our existing infrastructure?
So through you, Chair Nan, there's always room for innovation, and it is something that is thought of, one, through our annual continual improvement programs. What can we do that is new, that's going to increase efficiency of a process or provide an added value to the community for the services that we provide? We've got some significant capital projects coming our way, investments into the Woodward Water Treatment Plant, the Woodward Wastewater Treatment Plant, as well as the Dundas Wastewater Treatment Plant, and innovation and what's new, but what is new and proven at a scale that it's going to be sustainable for a system of our size are the things that we look at as part of the conceptual design for those projects. For example, we're looking at a potential change to the way that we manage our sedimentation and flocculation process at the water treatment plant as part of the upcoming capital program there. And that could look like going from a conventional system to a dissolved air flotation system, which will provide increased capacity. So we've always got a mind to innovation, and it's part of our annual infrastructure reviews to have those types of conversations as well.
Thank you. Councillor Sayre,
Thank you.
that was your last question, right?
That was it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Next up, we have Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor and Director. Thank you for your presentation. It's like one of those movies that we like to watch every 4 years, and we always see, oh yeah, I didn't think of that. Question for you with regards to, I guess it's on your notes, it was Regulation 453, 07, the financial plans. So who tests the sustainability of our financial plans for our water system?
So through you, Chair Nan, to the councillor, so that's a discussion to be had at council when we present those financial plans. The ministry only receives the financial plan. It's a requirement that it be part of our application in order to renew our drinking water licenses, but they're not an oversight body who is ensuring sustainable financing of our drinking water or wastewater systems. So the question of sustainability would come up as we complete that and present it to City Council. You know, I would mention that in the guidance document prepared by the province, they speak to different levels of I'll use the word detail in preparation of a financial plan and maturity of where you are with investments in your water systems. And I would say that where we will be and have been in the past is at the highest levels of maturity of that financial planning process. And that highest level of maturity speaks to you're able to demonstrate that you've got the finances needed to maintain your operational systems. That you are resourcing your quality management systems, that you have capital infrastructure plans. That highest level of maturity doesn't mean that you have all the finances you might need to fully tackle an infrastructure deficit, but the fact that you're aware of it and you're talking about it is that test for that highest level of maturity. We have those conversations annually as part of the capital budget process and the water, wastewater, stormwater rate budget process of where we are exactly with sustainable financing related to our drinking water system. But the financial plan doesn't require us to demonstrate that we're able to fully finance all of our operational needs, all of our annual capital, as well as fully tackle what is a significant infrastructure backlog. I hope that answers your question.
Partially. I guess it indicates that we have some work to do as we move forward with that financial plan. But I am concerned that that is a weakness in the regulation. We're lucky we have an Auditor General that can assist us with that audit. But I worry about other municipalities and the sustainability of their financial plan and who's verifying that. If it's just a political verification, then there could be risk there. So I just raised that in passing. What are the protocols in place to ensure that any risk to water safety is shared with council quickly? So I'm thinking, and I'll ask a second question about this, but our intake water is from Lake Ontario. And so what if there is a local issue of contamination that we become aware of? What's that protocol? How does it flow out to council?
So through you, Chair Nan. So we do have a communications procedure as well as emergency response instructions that speak to communications for various events. You know, to give you, to tag on to your example of potentially some water contamination out in the lake that would impact our ability to treat our drinking water effectively, first thing we would do is we would look for verification. We don't overreact to potential incidents of contamination because far more often than not, we find that there's an issue with a sample. Something is very easily resolved with system flushing or some work at the treatment plant. There was never any real health concern to the community. So first thing we would do would be to verify. If there was a real concern, then we have responsibilities to work with our partners both in public health and if there was a source protection issue with the source protection committees as well. And there would be a combined communication between myself as the leader of the operating authority in public health through to City Council at the time where a verified concern materialized. Where that communication where the communication may not come in the way that you might expect it is where we have legislated requirements, for example. A very simple example, if we had a total coliform hit out in the distribution system during one of our regular sample collections, we would go out and we'd resample, we'd flush the system, resample to see if there's a real concern. If we got a second hit there, then we now have obligations to work with public health. But there's no obligation to report to the community because total coliform is an indicator bacteria. It doesn't mean that something is going wrong. If we had an E. coli hit, which does happen from time to time, usually almost exclusively due to sample contamination in my experience, and there's different reporting obligations. And those are all spoken to both in our procedures as well as in the legislation as well. So there's different touch points with council, depending upon, or counseling in the community, I should say, depending upon the severity of an event.
Thank you for that. Deputy Mayor, can I ask, what are the quality controls for the intake of the water from the lake? The reason I ask is we have many of our neighboring municipalities who have outflows from their sewer plants directly into the lake. And the lake is not infinite. And so when we're taking water in, not putting it out, so are we checking water for contamination as it comes in, or do we assume we can handle whatever comes in the pipe and we just get rid of the solids and sanitize it and send it out?
Yeah, so through you, Chair Nan, there's a few different controls that are in place. First of all, we have 3 drinking water intakes, and they extend into the lake about 1 kilometer at a depth of about 12 meters. Where they are located, we've done our source water protection assessments, and Carmen spoke a little bit to that earlier. We have a intake protection zone that's been delineated around those intakes, and we've done various models related to, the Woodward wastewater treatment plant flow, for example, through Red Hill Creek and into Hamilton Harbor, and does it have an impact on our intakes? And the answer is no. Similar to the Skyway wastewater treatment plant in Burlington, which is the next closest, which also discharges into Hamilton Harbor. It would be extremely abnormal for us to see any impacts from a wastewater discharge impacting our drinking water intakes. And that goes for all wastewater treatment plants across the western basin of the Great Lakes. It would take some extremely unusual event for those type of treated wastewater discharges to have an impact on our intakes. Regardless, we do sample that incoming raw water every single day, looking at the quality of what's coming in. Municipal water treatment processes are meant to remove a lot of the things that you might find from wastewater, such as E. coli and other bacteria and pathogens. If we saw abnormal levels of E. coli or things like that, that would lead us to an investigation into what might be happening in the intake area, but it doesn't mean that there would be a breakdown in our ability to treat that water. I hope that answers that question.
Yes, it does. On page 38 of your slides, Madam Deputy Mayor, it speaks to the inspection reports. And there is a variety of outcomes from 93.57% to virtually 100%. Why the variation?
Through you, Chair Nan, thank you, Councillor, for the question. So we see different circumstances that occur in the systems that at some points have prevented us from achieving that 100% rating that we would like to. An example that happens on occasion in the Woodward drinking water system, for example, is we have a contractor, whether they're working for the city or working for a developer or a private company, who taps into a live water main without a certified licensed inspector on site. Hamilton is extremely proactive, and Hamilton Water is extremely proactive about every time that we find out about an incident that is a non-compliance with legislation, we tell the ministry right away. So sometimes we could be our worst own enemy because we are so transparent about the things that we find in our system. But we tell them, we implement a non-compliance in our quality management system, we investigate it, we follow up. You know, that's an example in the Woodward system where we've had some challenges, even with our own contractors who, you know, they're out doing a water main repair. And we have an inspector on site, but the inspector is looking at more than one job, and they leave the site for 15 minutes, and the contractor does something that they shouldn't without the inspector there, and it's something we've been working through our contracts and with vendor management to control. That's one example. There are situations that arise, and we speak to them in our annual drinking water report, as well as our summary report that goes to General Issues Committee. For example, in the Greensville system in 2022, we had an issue where we rehabilitated the well that serves that community, and sometimes there's misinterpretation of legislation. We draw water from the ground, it runs through a treatment system that would deal with any potential bacteria that's in that well before it's distributed into the municipal system there. There was a situation that occurred in Greensville where the legislation speaks to chlorination of the raw water well, as well as a holding time for that chlorinated well water before you reactivate the distribution system. There was the situation in 2022 is we missed that holding time. There wasn't a risk to the community because we had to have a treatment system in place as well as disinfection to deal with anything, but did we follow the legislation in that specific example to every single detail? No, we didn't. So we learned from that. That was caught in an inspection finding. It's built into our quality management system processes to make sure something like that is never missed again. So there's small items that come up from time to time that in some systems have kept us from meeting that 100% ranking. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that we've seen over the years that as we have different drinking water inspectors come through the system, they look for different things, and some are more thorough than others. So it's not uncommon for a new drinking water inspector to come in and identify something that previous inspectors haven't identified. And sometimes it's even, you know, they see things differently than the previous inspector, and we do sometimes get dinged for their perception of the regulations during the inspection process, whereas a previous inspector might have been completely okay and satisfied with the way we were doing things. So those are the things that we're managing in the background. We strive for that 100% ranking. More often than not, if we're not achieving 100%, it's because we've reported something that we found to the ministry during the year that they're looking at that inspection.
And thank you. Deputy Mayor, my last question is with regard to toxic algae, which you mentioned it is becoming more prevalent across North America and the world, to be fair, with the rising temperatures. How do we, I understand how we notify the public when it's in the harbor or something like that, or on a beach, and it's public health is that issue. How do we protect residents from the intake of water that is contaminated with that type of algae? What's the process? Because I hear this every summer with people concerned about algae, what's the process to remove that toxicity from the water so that our residents are safe? And that's my final question. Thank you so much for all of your answers in your presentation.
So through you, Chair Nan, so we monitor the intakes annually, and we work with partners, both with Environment Canada and the MECP, who do broader Great Lakes monitoring, looking for potential for algae bloom formation, for example. That's the first step. More often than not, because we do see on an annual basis, unfortunately, algae blooms within Hamilton Harbour itself, but that algae doesn't make its way, out through the shipping canal and into the broader lake and into an area where it can impact our drinking water intakes. But we do look for that. Every year we have a sampling program in the spring, summer months for our raw water, looking for any potential impacts from toxic algae, and that is a legislated requirement as well, looking for some of the chemical constituents that would show up from blue-green algae, for example. We are lucky here in Hamilton. We've had a granular activated carbon filtration system in place since the late 1990s. That resolves a lot of challenges with some of the typical algae that we might see, non-toxic algae. And what happens is that algae, as it's pulled in through your intakes, it can break down into taste and odor compounds, particularly as we chlorinate in advance of our filters. And that granular activated carbon removes those taste and odor compounds 9 times out of 10. And we do get the odd musty odor type of complaint late in the summer on a semi-annual basis or so. But really, the processes are in place that should there be a potentially toxic algae bloom that would impact our intakes, there's early detection systems. We would catch it in our regular sampling, and then we would do an investigation if we saw something to say, how bad is this? Can our treatment system handle what we're seeing? Or do we need a different type of intervention?
Thank you. Moving on the speakers list, we have Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor Nan. Good morning. Thank you so much, Senior Director Winters and Senior Coordinator Jackson, Manager Gert, and Senior Project Manager Vega. Outstanding water quality training session and updates for myself and for the new term of council. 3 general areas, Deputy Mayor Nan. I'll start with Senior Director Winters, and if he wants to answer them all, great. If he wants to delegate them to the other presenters, that's fine. Since it's been mentioned about Walkerton, Nick, wasn't it the fact that one of the contributing factors to that tragedy was the fact that there were some employees of the town that basically did not have, if you will, I'll call it in my own language, proper training, insufficient training, inadequate training, maybe absolute bare minimum training. And when the disaster started to unfold in the town, they were taking measures that were trying to flush the problem out of the system. Anyways, what I learned from that and the ensuing reports from, I believe, was Justice Campbell as well, was that improper training. So long preamble through you, Deputy Mayor Nan, to Senior Director Winters. Can I presume, and can we hear for public consumption, the top-notch training of all our employees within Hamilton Water are at an exemplary level? And maybe you can just further elaborate on the training that our staff have. Through you, Deputy Mayor, please.
Certainly, through you, Chair Nan. You're absolutely correct, Councillor Jackson. There were a lot of things that went wrong in the Walkerton scenario that unfortunately led to that tragedy, but one of them was certainly a lack of training for the operators of that water treatment and water distribution system. They didn't know what they didn't know because they weren't put in a position to be successful from a training perspective. Here in Hamilton and every water utility in Ontario, there's legislated requirements for training. So the only staff that can operate control our water distribution system, change pressures, close valves, change dosing of treatment chemicals, collect samples, they all have to have a valid operator's license, and that requires them to do 30 to 50 hours of annual training on drinking water, in this case drinking water related topics. They're required to take mandatory courses through the Walkerton Clean Water Agency that speak to standard of care, and they speak to the responsibilities that are associated with working within and operating a municipal drinking water system, and the requirements and responsibility for protection of public health. We take that training further, certainly, within Hamilton Water. We've got all of our licensed operators are getting their annual training, maintaining their certifications. We have all the regulatory required staff in place to be compliant with the legislation, trained and certified at the different levels based on the complexity of our municipal drinking water system. And certainly that training goes all the way through our management ranks and is built into our quality management system. You know, for example, it's not a requirement that we provide standard of care training to all of the senior leadership in Hamilton Water. We do it anyway. It's not a requirement that we provide standard of care training to the customer contact center within Hamilton, who handles they're the first line for incoming calls if there's concerns about the water system, but we do it anyway. Making sure that everyone who's involved potentially in calls or interventions related into our drinking water systems or infrastructure have all the appropriate training. And council, you don't see this on an annual basis, but the budgets to support that training are all built into our annual operating budget, which council sees the bigger number. They don't necessarily see that, you know, we have in and around $200,000 worth of training funds built into that operating budget on an annual basis, but we do.
Excellent, outstanding reassurances on the training component within Hamilton Water, Senior Director. Thank you. Deputy Mayor, second category of questions. Sorry to ask this, Nick, but just to wrap on Shadok, and forgive me again if I oversimplify it, but from a layman's standpoint, on behalf of the community I represent on the East Mountain, the SCADA system, that was some wonderful technological system that was to monitor all the dozens and dozens of CSO water treatment facilities, I think approximately 70 overall, correct me if I'm wrong, across our entire city. The SCADA system that, if you will, failed for 4.5 years, didn't notice an open gate or two. Can I just humbly ask, has that all been corrected, and or what needed to be upgraded has been done through you, Deputy Mayor Nan? And again, if I'm oversimplifying it, Nick, just correct it for my knowledge and for my constituents that are listening in.
So through you, Chair Nan. So I will say that the system is operating the way it should to identify for us any issues where there might be a discharge of wastewater to the natural environment. Is it fully upgraded? I'm going to say no, because we want to go beyond that. One of the things we're working on in 2023 is adding some redundant controls to our combined sewer overflow gates that will give us an early warning should some of the situations that happened with Shadok occur, such as, you know, a gate spindle is turning, but it's stripped, so the gate isn't actually moving. So we'll give ourselves some redundant sensors that will identify for us if there's potentially an investigation that we need to do. But in the interim, we've covered those gaps with periodic physical inspections. As well as where we have gates that are potentially going to lead to a spill to the environment, like happened with Shadok Creek. Any of those gates are closed and locked. So the only way they're going to move is if someone physically goes and undoes a lock in the field and then it operates a control, and that's all covered and trained into people through the standard operating procedures that have been revised for all of those facilities. I will take it just a little farther because we're talking about drinking water at this point in time. You know, historically, there was a significant difference between the wastewater utility operation versus the drinking water utility operation. And Walkerton led to a bunch of changes that Susan and Wendy have spoken about from a regulatory perspective, from a risk management or from a quality management perspective, but then building into risk management and infrastructure review. And one of the things that's been in place on the water side since the inception of the Drinking Water Quality Management Standard is a requirement for a risk management assessment of all the critical control points in our water treatment and distribution system. So that's anywhere where a change can be made to the system that could potentially impact drinking water quality. Those are all listed on a register. We go through them in a fulsome manner every 3 years, but on a lighter manner every year to verify that the monitoring and response procedures related to all those critical control points are in place. And that links into the SCADA system because every one of those critical control points is monitored on SCADA. Historically, that didn't happen on the wastewater side. It's one of the reasons, and we'll get into it when we talk briefly here about the operation of the wastewater utility and the legislative framework. It's one of the reasons why one of our first responses to Shidok was to voluntarily implement a wastewater quality management system. We're one of the only utilities in Ontario that has a quality management system for wastewater, and it was to add that layer of discipline, that layer of quality management, and the tools that we use on drinking water that we've learned are very successful, implement those on the wastewater side.
Terrific, Deputy Mayor. Thank you for that promising and encouraging news on the overall water quality system and SCADA. Last category, Deputy Mayor, again, only because the presenters mentioned it, about Flint. The situation in Flint was, I believe, it was that the town council decided to save some money going to an alternate water supply. That could never, ever, ever happen in our city because we have the one main water supply. Or hypothetically, Nick, could that ever happen in Hamilton? Through you, Deputy Mayor Nan, and that's my last question.
So through you, Chair Nan, the short answer is no. I'd take it a little bit farther. I mean, switching the supply for a drinking water system isn't completely unusual in the industry. We wouldn't have the opportunity to do that here in Hamilton, and it would be ridiculous for us to consider it given that we draw directly from the Great Lakes. But one of the major components of the Flint water crisis is that the due diligence on what it meant to switch that supply was not done. The engineering assessments to say, when we take water from, when we switch from water from the Detroit River to another water source, what is the change in chemical components of that raw water, and what impact is it going to have on our treatment facilities and our drinking water system? And that wasn't done. Why I mention that is because if there was ever a scenario where we as the operating authority were considering making a change to the way that we treat drinking water, the way that we distribute drinking water, it's our responsibility to make sure that all of those assessments are done. And if there's any risks associated with it, to communicate those through to the owner, which is council and mayor.
Deputy Mayor Nan, concluding comment. Senior Director Winters, we're in excellent hands, and thank you again for this presentation. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Nan.
Thank you, Councillor. Next up, we have Councillor McMeekin.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor Nan. And I had 3 points I wanted to raise. Councillor Jackson is always pretty sharp. He raised 2 of them around the training and Shidok, and my good friend Councillor Wilson raised the generic issue around Walkerton and regulations. So I don't have a specific question, but I will use some time just to reflect a tad. In the summer of 2000, I was a candidate in a provincial by-election when the Walkerton story. It couldn't spend a lot of time on the ground then because we had family in Walkerton who unfortunately consumed some of that bad water and got quite sick. So we were shuffling back and forth there. The whole business of vigilance, the lesson that I learned, and fortunately many others learned, has to do with vigilance. as Justice O'Connor pointed out, pre-Walkerton, there was the red tape issue, and unbelievably, the government of the day took the provision that any test for E. coli had to be reported to three different agencies of people. It had to be reported to the Minister of the Environment, also the Medical Officer of Health, and finally the operators themselves. The operators were then designated as the only people that needed to be informed of an E. coli. And both of them swore under oath before the commission that they didn't know E. coli could kill you. And so that certainly speaks to the training that Councillor Jackson picked up on. So the lesson, I think, for all of us is when people start talking regulations, simple example from perhaps a rural perspective. If you talk about taking down a fence, you've got to stop and ask yourself why the fence was put up in the first place. And, a failure to do that can lead to terrible, terrible consequences. If it were not for the vigilance of a Murray McQuaig, the medical officer of health, who said, "The hell with this, I'm going to test that water myself." Hundreds, maybe thousands of people in Walkerton were potentially at risk of death. So I'm really pleased. I love the presentation. It shows we're on top of things. The assurances that have been sought are comforting. I know from speaking with the Bay Area restoration folk that they talk glowingly about the quality of our water, which is good. Simply put, if you can't breathe the air, nothing else matters. And if we've got water that is not safe to drink, we're in real trouble. And I'm confident that we're in pretty good shape. And thank you and your team for your presentation. And let's just remind ourselves next time someone comes calling saying we're going to cut regulations, and maybe that's okay. But let's ask straight up as we can why that regulation was put in place in the first place. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Councillor. Next up, we have Councillor A. Wilson.
Thank you. And through the chair, thank you so much for the presentation today. I just have two quick questions. One is about novel pollutants and how we're tracking maybe more long-term pieces. And so a couple of kind of first questions regarding that are about PFAS and microplastics in Hamilton drinking water. We know our Great Lake basins are accumulating these forever chemicals, and so they may not be a problem today, they may not be a problem tomorrow. Are we confident they won't be a problem in 25 years from a drinking water perspective? And do we have any knowledge about PFAS and microplastics today in our drinking water system?
So through you, Chair Nan, thank you, Councillor Wilson, for the question. Absolutely, those constituents are on our radar. Annually, we do an emergency, thank you, Wendy, an emergency issues exercise, or emerging issues, exercise, where we're looking at the latest science or trends in the industry and what should we be digging into, and both PFOS and PFAS and microplastics have been on our radar for a number of years. It is still early days from are they a concern here in Hamilton, and I can say that because we've done a risk analysis a couple of years ago, particularly for PFOS and PFAS, and identified that the risk was very low given the fact that we draw waters directly or drinking water directly from the Great Lakes. But we have been monitoring what's been happening in the industry. Certainly there is a lot of work on this happening south of the border. About PFOS and PFAS in drinking water, and we just saw about a month ago that Health Canada is starting to do some analysis here in Canada about PFOS and PFAS in drinking water. So we're providing comments into those guidelines. We've been working with our partners, both with Environment Canada and with the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, with data sharing to see if and when PFOS and PFAS in particular become a concern that Hamilton has to worry about. Presently, the answer is no. From a microplastics perspective, it's a similar story. It is an emerging field of study in whether or not there's an impact to drinking water here in Hamilton. We've done in the past some pilot sampling of our raw water coming into the treatment plant, looking particularly for microplastics, and certainly they're there. I can tell you that our treatment system and all municipal treatment systems are built that a pollutant like that would be removed through coagulation, flocculation, and filtration processes. But it is something that we're keeping an eye on as well. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and thank you through the chair. It does. I think when folks are reading about how, for example, all of the fish caught in the Great Lakes have extreme PFAS concerns right now, microplastic concerns. I think we know that these contaminants are in our water bodies, and what I'm hearing from you is they're not necessarily entering our drinking water systems in a way that either we're worried about or at all today. And I think it's just that prompt or that thought about how much can a pollutant accumulate in an ecosystem before we're over that tipping point, and when does early action or preventative action come into place to stop us from getting to that point where they're ever a concern in the first place? And obviously this is a multi-jurisdictional approach. So yes, I think that did answer the question, and it did also kind of give me a sense of where we're thinking about this and who we're working with, and the role for federal leadership as well. Another question, completely switching gears, is about how do we engage rural residents on well water in both safety and testing considerations, but then also when there is an issue, or if there is an issue in a water body that we know that residents in the city of Hamilton are pulling well water from, what does that communication protocol look like?
Certainly. So through you, Chair Nan, I'll ask Carmen to take the lead on that, and if it's valuable, I can chime in as well.
Yes, through you, Chair Nan. So my understanding is that your question relates to private well water users. Is that correct?
Yeah, rural Hamiltonians who are pulling their well water from, yes, private wells, but sometimes we're doing water sampling from the water bodies or the groundwater that they are pulling water from. So we have information even if we're not the well operator.
Yes, so we have a number of groundwater monitoring wells throughout the rural area. And if we come across results that indicate there are certain contaminants in the groundwater aquifer, then we'll inform public health and the Ministry of Environment about it.
Thank you through the chair. Just a question about, through informing the Minister of Environment and Public Health, what does a resident notification, like the resident notification piece is the piece I'm hoping to kind of jump in on and specify in on. So we find a contaminant either in the Great Lakes water body, like the Lake Ontario water body, where some residents do pull water directly from the Great Lakes as well via their well. And then we also have residents who are pulling from groundwater. We find a contaminant, we find a concern. What does our notification system look like once we've notified the Ministry of the Environment and Public Health to residents specifically?
Through you, Chair Nan, if the concern is related to a current Hamilton Water project, we have a process through which we inform the residents within the immediate area of that project. If the concern is related to natural concentrations in the groundwater, then we work with Public Health and Ministry of Environment on how to inform the private well water users.
Through you, Chair Nana, if I can add on to that, luckily this doesn't happen, at least not in my experience, but if it did, we'd be working with our counterparts in public health who would be reaching out to the residents and recommending, very likely, it's their legislation, but very likely recommending testing of the private well itself to determine whether or not that concern that was identified in one of our municipal monitoring wells actually carries over to where the residents are accessing drinking water for their homes.
Thank you, through Chair Nan. I think my last kind of question, or maybe it's a rhetorical question, is just about the accuracy of those lists, or when we're doing that notification, how are we ensuring that no one's being left behind and that folks aren't being left out? For example, when we did have the Shit Oak sewer spill into the Coots Paradise Basin, there are residents that do directly pull well water and may have appreciated notification about changing their filters. Like, they were fine, they're still filtering their water, but that changes your maintenance cycle. Knowing that there was a heavy pollution in the water cycle has an impact on how you maintain that private well. We similarly heard from RBG at the time regarding communication. So that's just like a 2018 based example of there may have been a gap in that notification. And I guess I'm just wondering how, when it comes to, because we don't want, when there is an emergency or when there is a concern, to be going, oh, our data list isn't ready to go, or we don't have the numbers there, or we don't know which households are where. Just a little bit more clarity is what I'm seeking on just how that resident notification specifically works and how we ensure that we're not missing people is maybe what I'm really trying to get at through this line of questioning.
So through you, Chair Nan, I suspect that Carmen can speak to our knowledge and awareness of where those private wells exist through the records associated with that.
Yes, so we are using two systems. One of the systems, it's our internal GIS system that includes information on each property. And we are also pulling records from the Ministry of Environment that has a record of all the private wells. So we are making sure that all properties that may be within that rural area and that may have a well are included in our mailing list.
Thanks, through the chair. I think those are all my questions. I just want to kind of note that in 2018, there was at least one resident that felt like they were missed that got talked about in the news at the time. Just a flag there, and maybe it's because they were pulling directly from the lake as opposed to groundwater that happened. And I know that's very, very rare. But just ensuring that we can and do, and it sounds like there's a lot of great work going on. So thanks so much for the entire presentation today. Those were just the two kind of hanging things for me. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor. Next up, we have Councillor Kretsch, followed by Councillor Kassar, the Mayor, and then Councillor Pauls.
Thank you. And through the chair and seeing the speakers list in front of me, I'll be brief. I have two questions. One's about lead. So thanks to Councillor Maureen Wilson for her questions earlier. Really tackled a lot of what I wanted to ask, frankly. And so I just had one remaining question. And what the relationship is to, you talked about the number 10 being the standard now, and I'm not sure exactly what the measurement was, at micrograms, maybe you said. And then, there being 5, and you said, well, we're ready for it. Where do we lie on that scale now, though? Being ready for it is one thing, but are we kind of already at that in terms of that lower limit, or what we have to do to get there?
So through you, Chair Nan, I'd mentioned that we'd have to do under Schedule 15.1 of Regulation 170, we're required to conduct biannual lead sampling within the community. That's 51 samples here in the Woodward distribution system, which includes Ward 2. And typically, as part of that sampling, we're seeing very few exceedances of the 10 micrograms per liter. That number of exceedances has been decreasing since the implementation of our corrosion control program. We know that the way that the orthophosphate, the inhibitor, works is it reacts with the walls of pipes, for example, lead pipes, and creates an insoluble precipitate that prevents lead from leaching into drinking water. And so we've been working since 2018 in the implementation of that corrosion control program, both with lead pipe test loops that we've installed in various locations across the system to assess the effectiveness of that precipitate formation, and therefore the reduced risk of lead leaching into the drinking water. We monitor that as well as we look at the residential lead sampling results. We've also had consultant reviews of our programs. They're the experts on this type of corrosion control inhibitor and receive feedback about the effectiveness of that program as well. So we do know that the corrosion control inhibitor is working. We do know that we do still see occasional exceedances through our lead sampling program, but that they are decreasing.
Thank you. So the exceedances are, of course, above the 10 micrograms is what you're talking about. So I guess
Correct.
The question I'm asking is, what do you think we need to do to get to that place where it would, you said we're prepared. I think you mean psychologically from a water perspective. But I mean, what about physically? Like what do we have to do to get to that place where we could hit 5?
So I understand the question. Through you, Chair Nan, the answer is just time. It takes time for the corrosion inhibitor to reach its full effectiveness within the system. Typically there's a recommendation where you come in with a higher dose of orthophosphate for a period of time, and over time you reach sustainability of that chemical, and you can actually reduce it. Reduce the dosage to maintain the effectiveness in the system. So we haven't reached that point where we're reducing that orthophosphate dosage yet, but we are monitoring. It's just a matter of time before we get there. And that's what we see is the decreasing trends of drinking water through our sampling. We're just waiting to reach that point where we know we've hit that point where we can reduce to a maintenance dosage, and that maintenance dosage will be maintaining that lead level below that 5 micrograms per liter. That's what we're working towards, regardless of whether or not there's a regulatory change or not.
And what does that timeline look like?
That's, through your Chair Nan, that's a magic question. We don't know for sure. What we can tell you is that we continue to look at it annually to review it with our third-party experts, but I can't put a specific date to it.
Okay, thanks. My second line of questioning is specifically about environmental impacts. And so we talked a lot about valuing our natural assets, and I noticed councillors from Alex Wilson, other councillors asked questions about impacts to the natural environment from PFAS, microplastics. I noticed that, for instance, there was an article in 2020 about an acid leak, a potential acid leak out in Cherry Beach. And one of the statements in the article said, we weren't really sure what the environmental impacts of this effluent, whatever it might have been, right, could be on the natural ecosystem. I think of Coots, right? I think of how a lot of the water there now has become stagnant. So I guess what I'm asking is, and I'll leave it on the last point because I think it's a very broad question, is what are we doing sometime in terms of mitigation? How aggressive are we being? One way, for instance, to deal with some of the issues here is to plant more cattails. I know that BARC and other groups have been, having folks go down there and do that. I know Councillor Maureen Wilson has been down with the cattails with the boots on. And so what is the City of Hamilton doing to aggressively implement those kinds of natural restoration projects to ensure that regardless of whether we understand the total complexity of the impact, we're doing everything we can to mitigate them?
So through you, Chair Nan, from an environmental impacts within the watershed perspective, we kicked off our City of Hamilton Watershed Action Plan just 2 years ago. Initially, there was a lot of focus on the Cheadoke Creek discharge event, rightly so, and that work continues to hopefully get that creek dredged here in 2023. That is the plan. It included some early works from a pilot perspective with mitigating installations such as floating wetland treatment island as a pilot to monitor the effectiveness of that type of system in reducing nutrient loadings in an area within Coots Paradise. But the greater works are going to come out of the environmental assessments that are being completed under that watershed action plan. We have 3 environmental assessments that are progressing presently. One is looking at sewer separation in the Ainslie Wood area. One is looking at retrofits within the stormwater system in the upstream sewer system to reduce impacts to the watershed. And then one is looking at what can we do within the watershed itself? And perhaps, there's a lot of things that are being explored through that, such as potentially additional dredging, such as inactivation of nutrients, installation of more floating treatment islands. There's a laundry list of things that will be analyzed, but we'll bring the results of that environmental assessment in front of council. and identify what should we as a community be moving forward with, and what's it going to cost, and what kind of timeline it's going to take. So I wish I had more answers, but I mean, those studies are slated for completion here in 2023. It'll be late in the year, and then we'll be talking about what are the hard findings of those studies and what does implementation start to look like.
Thanks, I appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to reading the environmental assessments. And fortunately or unfortunately, I've read every word of every ministry order on the subject, and it seems like what the city is doing at this time, from my perspective, is we're following the ministry's guidelines with respect to how we're mitigating these situations. You talked about dredging, and having read the reports, the effectiveness of dredging and including the consultants, there's a varying range of the effectiveness of that dredging. We're ordered to do it, so we're going to do it. What I'm saying to you, though, is something beside that, right, or apart from that. I understand what the orders are. I understand what we have to do, but we can rely on folks like our conservation authorities, right? The RBG, science in general, if I should say very broadly, for proactive, aggressive, bold measures to really restore some of what's been degraded as a result of our usage of the water system as human beings, and especially our usage of the water system in the city of Hamilton and in the shape of that colonial structure. So I'm thinking about things Indigenous water walkers have talked about for years. So I guess what I'm asking you is, how aggressively are we, apart from ministry orders, really going down this road of sort of restoration of our natural waterways?
Yeah, so through you, Chair Nan, I'd say we are being aggressive, and one of the things I would mention is that as we went through the response to the Chedoke Creek discharge incident and the first set of orders that required us to do a bunch of analysis, and there was we've spoken about this at General Issues Committee previously, but there was initially a recommendation that dredging of Chedoke Creek may not provide a benefit. And the information was all submitted to the Ministry of the Environment for their review and feedback. The City of Hamilton didn't stop there. We didn't just say, okay, we've submitted our responses to the order and now we're just going to sit and wait. We took proactive action through a watershed-wide assessment to identify opportunities and future activities to begin the path towards a citywide watershed action plan, and some of these things that are happening now. What we saw, because we did that voluntarily, is that in the second set of orders, the ministry picked up on that work that we're already doing and chose to order us to finish it. So when I speak about us being aggressive, is we were taking action and then we saw that it kind of got redirected back on us in a different way, which is fine. We were going to do it anyway, right? But we put that effort forward. Council and staff working together on what that type of action plan should look like for the benefit of our community. And within those watershed action planning discussions, there are a number of aggressive items that will come in front of committee for consideration as well. We're working very closely with all of our partners, as we have for decades with HHRAP particularly, but to tease out the best ideas that are there and who has responsibility, where is their municipal responsibility, where do we need to work with the province on some of the ideas that'll come out of it, who's best to deliver based on skill sets and scope of responsibility as well. So I think there's a lot of good things that are going to come out of it that we're looking forward to talking about.
Thanks, appreciate that.
Thank you. Next up, Councillor Kassar.
Thanks, Chair Nan, and I will be brief. I just have one question remaining. So through you, on slide 9, it talked about drinking water systems not managed by Hamilton Water. I just wanted to know if you could elaborate on that and why those situations exist. I understand risk assessments are underway for them, but if you could just expand on that. It just went by kind of quickly. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Through you, Chair Nan, I'll ask Manager Susan Gert to respond to that.
Yes, thank you, Nick. Through you, Madam Chair. The small drinking water systems are not considered to be municipal residential systems. They fall under a separate act, and they are maintained by those operating authorities on behalf of you as the owner. So they are small municipal or rural recreational systems or the nursery schools, as I mentioned. So it's a different piece of legislation from the Safe Drinking Water Act that we follow for the municipal residential systems.
And if I was to add on to that through you, Chair Nan, if there were concerns related to the operation of those systems, committee would certainly be hearing about it through public health in partnership with the operators of those systems, whether it's corporate facilities, whether it is recreation.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Chair Nan.
Thank you, Councillor. Next up, we have Mayor Horwath, please.
Thanks very much, Chair Nan. I just have a couple specific questions around the slides. But the first one is through you, Chair. You mentioned the issue of the backwater valve program, and that we didn't get where we needed to be with voluntary compliance. And so where are we now, and when will we be getting a sense of if and how we move forward?
Through you, Chair Nan, thank you for the question. So we've had a backflow prevention bylaw in place since 2012, so just over 10 years. And the way that the bylaw works is it requires industrial, commercial, institutional properties to complete a risk survey to identify what's happening on the facility, and based on that risk assessment, what manner of backflow preventer is best suited to protect the city's water distribution system from the risks associated with that property. And so our challenge over the years has been, one, getting the surveys completed, but then two, once the surveys are completed and they identify that a property needs to install a backflow prevention device, are we getting those devices installed? And what we'd seen prior to, just before the pandemic, is that our numbers for increasing the number of surveys to be completed was starting to stall out, so we weren't getting as much uptake about that. We were seeing uptake where a device had been identified as required to be installed, that over time those things were getting installed. You know, for example, the biggest facilities in Hamilton, the steel companies, McMaster University as an example, the industries that are of a significant risk all have their backflow devices installed. So the biggest risks are under control. It's getting into the smaller companies, or the ones that may have not have completed a survey yet, that we don't fully understand that level of risk. We had brought before committee in late 2019 a plan for beginning enforcement under that backflow prevention bylaw. And we were going to launch a pilot in early 2020 to test out that enforcement program and learn some lessons before we considered how we were going to move it forward across the remaining properties that we don't have those type of assessments completed for. Unfortunately, the pandemic stalled us. On that, a big component of that program is actually accessing facilities in order to look at what they're doing and where their plumbing systems are, and opportunities to install those backflow preventers. So I can tell you in 2023, we're just picking that work up again. The pilot program that we'd initially planned will kick off this year, and council will receive a renewed notification about what that looks like, in case you're hearing from any properties within your wards with regards to interactions with that program. But we still intend to learn those lessons to make sure that we've got the best possible program moving forward that's fair to the property owners, but is protecting those risks. The last thing I just say is, from a city compliance perspective, because we have facilities that are a risk as well. The last I checked, and I think it was just last week, we were at about 98% compliance of devices installed as well. So we're doing pretty well. We will ramp up our enforcement here in 2023.
That's good to hear. I guess flowing from that, do we have a proactive way of addressing new companies, for example, that might be coming in, so that we don't have to do the follow-up, but it's built into site plan or whatever?
So through you, Chair Nan, we absolutely do, yes. That is built into the development application process of assessment of uses and identification. It's on the developer's engineer to identify, based on the bylaw provisions, what device they need to install based on the property use, and then that's inspected through our colleagues in planning and economic development as well. And Hamilton Water provides training for PED about that program to make sure that they stay aware.
That's great. Thank you. One more, well, I have two more questions actually, but the next one, through you, Chair Nan, is on slide 43. I think it was a slide about risks, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just pull it up here. Okay. The last bullet, contractors conducting work without a Hamilton Water operator in charge. So can you explain what that means and to what extent does this, so when I read this, what came to my mind was those discoveries that we're seeing in terms of contractors that did work back in the 90s, and we're seeing that things were not connected properly. And so this might have nothing to do with that, but it's certainly flagged in my mind. So is there a requirement, and is this one of those regulations that have been watered down, or is this a red tape issue? Is this a staffing issue? Is this a financial issue? Can you kind of let me know what's going on there?
Yeah, certainly, through you, Chair Nan. So I would consider it to be quite different from the sewer cross-connection issues that we've been speaking to. The issue is that only licensed operators are allowed to work on the city's municipal drinking water system. And contractors are not able to get those licenses. So they require a licensed inspector from the city to be on site overseeing what they're doing for portions of the work. If a developer is excavating in the road allowance, preparing for connection of services to the city's system, we don't need a licensed water operator there to observe them digging the excavation. But when they are making a physical connection to a City of Hamilton water main, there has to be a licensed inspector there to observe what they do, making sure that they're following the right procedures, that they're disinfecting the equipment that they're using to make the connection. First off, that they're using the appropriate materials to make that connection, that the work is done in a way that is going to ensure that there's not a future leak there and lost revenue or potentially a sinkhole or things like that. So that's the issue that we're speaking to, is that there have been a very few, but there continues to be a few instances every year where we either have a contractor that's not working for the city, who is out doing work, and they touch our infrastructure without having a licensed inspector on site. Or we've even experienced issues where with our own contractor, for example, the contractor who does our lead water service replacements on public property, they do 700 of them a year, but there's one or two instances where, the inspector walks down the block and they tap, which means make a connection into a water main without the inspector physically observing that. And we report those as non-compliances to the ministry. So again, we're extremely transparent about it, which leads to some impacts on our water system ratings through the inspections, but we're always going to tell the ministry where something's happened that shouldn't have. So that's what we're talking about. Within our own contracts, we've got vendor performance that we use to control that. With the external contractors who are maybe doing something without us being there to see it, it's a little more difficult for us to control, but we're working on that process as well.
That's great. Thanks so much. And then my last kind of question is more just a comment about the information on slide 41. This is what is it called, like a dashboard or a scorecard, KPI scorecard. There's a couple of instances. I looked to the top left, 391 metrics, 67% with targets, so presumably, 23 without. When would that, is there an expectation that targets are going to be set? And then similarly on the bottom right, the little square there has some things that look like they need to be worked on, and just want to make sure that, I guess my point is we have KPIs for a reason, and that's because we work towards the, the ability to measure our progress and achieve our goals. So I'll have to do some of my own work around what some of these numbers represent, because it's not really clear on the slides, but there are some places where it looks like, and I'm not talking about the financial KPI at this point, I'm talking about some of the other pieces and whether there are work plans to kind of address that stuff.
Yeah, so through you, Chair Nan, there absolutely are. With regards to setting targets related to metrics, sometimes a metric is just information. And having a target doesn't provide real value. For example, a number of development applications that we review on an annual basis. We don't set a target for that. We're prepared with resources to respond as they come in, but we don't necessarily say that, we're going to hit 1,000 development application reviews in a year. What comes in, comes in. So that would be an example of a metric that we track, number of development applications that we review, but we don't necessarily say that, hey, we thought we were going to get 1,000 this year and we didn't, so do we need to do something about that? For some of the other targets, you mentioned on the bottom right, for example, 80.67% of spill incidents responded to within our target period, which was below our standard. There's absolutely a work plan within our environmental monitoring and enforcement group. We were dealing with a number of vacancies at the officer position, and that led directly to our inability in all cases to get out to spills within our service levels. But as we fill those vacancies and get those staff trained up, then that will alleviate that. In any situation where we are not meeting a KPI, we analyze it. I mentioned it this time of year. We go through what we call a sectional annual reporting process, where every section in Hamilton Water is looking at their year in review for 2022 and what went well and where were their challenges and how are we going to address those challenges. What is the strategic work plan for 2023 and moving forward, and what do I as the director need to be speaking to City Council about where we might need some support to address those challenges. A part of that is a review of those all of those KPIs and where we aren't measuring up what is that work plan to get us to where we need to be.
Thanks, Director Winters. That's all, Chair Nan. Thank you.
Thank you. And next up, we have Councillor Pauls, followed by Councillor Taddison.
Thank you. And I had my video off. I've been under the weather, so, but I needed to ask one question. Maybe it's obvious or not, but it's under the Safe Drinking Water Act, under the license and manage and operate. It says we have drinking water work permit, financial plan, operation plan. We have accreditation. And then the one that is interesting is permit to take the water. I wonder, does the act also dictate what kind, where we take the water from, what body of water? And if they do we have a limit of it or how much we can take?
So through you, Chair Nan, the short answer to both questions is yes. If we were to be submitting a new request for a permit to take water for a new treatment system, for example, we would specify to the ministry of where we would like to collect that water from, and that would be part of their review process of whether they were going to grant that request, along with all the other information that we'd submit. For our permits to take water for our drinking water system, we're required to renew them periodically, but we're always talking about collecting water from the same source. And so, for example, for the Woodward Water Treatment Plant, we take that water from Lake Ontario. There is a limit on it. Our permit to take water limit is 909 megaliters per day, or 909 million liters per day of raw water that we could move through our water treatment plant. And then when we get into our waterworks permit, that speaks to how we're taking that water. What does the infrastructure look like to move the water from the lake into the water treatment plant, and then the downstream processes. I hope that answers that question.
Yes, it does. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Next up, we have Councillor Taddison.
Just a couple of questions to Senior Director Winters through the chair. I guess I'll go back to overflows and bypasses. Just I was looking at some recent data, and it says that there's been no overflows that have occurred in the last 48 hours, so that's a good thing. On February 9th this year, 2023, it says that the Green Hill CSO tank was, you know, in operation, I guess, for 3.75 hours, and 14 million liters, and I'm assuming it was wastewater, was released. Where does that water go?
So through you, Chair Nan, so it would be combined sewage, so wastewater mixed with a whole bunch of stormwater. That's the only reason those CSO facilities are active. But in the case of the Green Hill CSO tank, that discharges to the Red Hill Creek.
Okay. If I was to look at the Wentworth CSO, I guess it's called an outfall, there's no flow metering present, but it actually flowed out for 8.75 hours. If we're not measuring that, how do we know how much has gone? And then can I ask where it does go?
Certainly. So through you, Chair Nan, from where it does go, that CSO facility discharges to Hamilton Harbor. The Wentworth Street Pier, which I should know the pier number by heart, but I don't. That's where it goes. On an annual basis, as part of our requirements under federal legislation, we conduct a consulting assignment that looks at hydraulic modeling of our combined sewer system. And what it does in a nutshell is it looks at the actual storms that occurred within the city in 2022, for example, uses our hydraulic model to say, based on that computer simulation, how much combined sewage went out of each outfall for each event. And that becomes part of a report that we submit to the Environment Canada, we also posted on our website. We did that for the first time in 2022 for public consumption for anyone that may be interested. So that's a modeled value for those discharges. Yeah. We are working, we actually have 2 different projects in the works in 2023 that are looking at installing additional measuring equipment on combined sewer overflow locations that don't currently have that. The Wentworth CSO is one of them, and actually by the time we get through these projects, and I'd love to be able to tell you it's going to be by the end of 2023, but I'll have to check with the project managers of where they are in their schedule. What we're going for is not necessarily to be able to measure every drop of combined sewage that makes its way into the natural environment. That's a much bigger and more expensive endeavor. But we do want to be able to communicate to the public whenever there is combined sewage coming out of an outfall. Where it makes sense, we will measure it absolutely, but some of these outfalls, for example, in order to accurately calculate how much combined sewage leaves the outfall during a single rain event, we'd have to have monitoring equipment at 67 different locations, which is not realistic. So for some of the locations, we'll have measurement in some places, and then we'll have to use our computer models to fill in the data gaps after the fact.
So is there any studies, through the chair, is there any studies to show how accurate the models are? Like, do you have actually challenged that model to see whether it is actually accurate?
So through you, Chair Nan, we have to do that as well. Yes, models have to be calibrated. They're calibrated by installing flow meters out in the system and measuring, you know, in this area of the sewer system, do we see the response in the sewer pipe that the model predicts? And if we don't, we recalibrate the model and make sure that that's accurate. That's an ongoing process to make sure that those models are as accurate as they can be.
Can I return back to the discharge into the Red Hill Creek? At what point, how do we monitor that there's no detrimental effects from those overflows into the creek? And that's like environmentally.
Yeah, so through you, Chair Nan, so I can tell you a couple things. First, any time that we have a combined sewer discharge or overflow to the natural environment, there's a post-inspection process that happens at the outfall, and it's looking for evidence of floatable materials, for example. Is there something there that we as Hamilton Water may need to go and clean up as a part of this unfortunately normal operation of our system? We have environmental compliance approvals for all those facilities, and those ECAs don't require us necessarily to perform environmental monitoring to assess the impacts from a pollutant loading perspective of combined sewer overflows. We do perform monitoring within the Red Hill Creek, and it's related to our Woodward wastewater treatment plant upgrade program. There's a 10-year monitoring program associated with that construction project that does pick up loadings and impacts within the Red Hill Creek area specifically, but that would be unique to that area. You know, aside from the work that's going on in the Shadoke area, that's ongoing with consulting assignments related to dredging and then other potential works under the Watershed Action Plan. We don't do broader monitoring for, say, the Hamilton Harbor combined sewer overflow locations, but other partners do. Okay. And so the information that we gather as part of the system of our operation becomes discussion points with our partners through the HH-RAP community. And through those partnerships, that's how we're assessing the broader impacts to Hamilton Harbor and the health of the harbor. And as we start to talk about moving towards delisting the harbor as an area of concern, how are we going to know based on that water quality data that we are going to when can we approach that delisting conversation? The last thing I should mention is 2 years ago we kicked off our surface water quality monitoring program. And that does collect water quality samples across our watersheds. Again, looking for indicators that our infrastructure is having an unintended impact that we need to investigate. So those are evolving data sets, but they're meant to close that gap on what impacts our combined sewer overflow is having as well.
Thank you for that answer, Senior Director Winters. And through the chair, just one more question and shifting gears now. If I was to look at the drinking water systems, just a couple of questions here. The 50 road subsystem, why is that a subsystem?
Through you, Chair Nan.
I don't know.
So it is a subsystem because it's a component of our Woodward distribution system. But in that area, we actually receive drinking water from the town of Grimsby. Okay. And so if we didn't do that, if we supplied that, I'll call it a pressure district, there's actually 2 pressure districts there. If we supplied them from the Woodward water treatment plant, there actually wouldn't be any Woodward subsystems. There would just be the Woodward system. But because in this instance we receive water from the town of Grimsby, it means that we've got the vast majority of the Woodward system, which is supplied by the Woodward water treatment plant, and about 600 homes in the 50 road area that are supplied from the town of Grimsby.
And going further along that, if we look at Carlisle, Freelton, Greensville, and Linden, I'm just trying to, are they supplied from an aquifer? Is that their water base?
So through you, Chair Nan, yes, those are all well-based, groundwater, well-based drinking water systems.
Can I ask then, is there a cost difference per liter to provide those areas with water as compared to our urban consumers?
So through you, Chair Nan, yes. I can't give you the number, but what I can tell you is that, you know, if I look at the town of Greensville, for example, or the community of Greensville, sorry, which is, I think, about 32 service connections, so 32 properties. We are looking at replacing that water system in the near future as soon as we finish off an addendum to an environmental assessment. And for those 32 properties, what we know is that there is a minimum cost to municipal drinking water services. And for that community, it's in the range of $6 million to $8 million for a treatment system for 32 properties. The cost to install infrastructure for smaller communities is more costly per property to a point. And I say that because, for example, that $6 million to $8 million treatment system that we need to install in Greensville, we could take that same system and install it in a community of 200, and it would be a $6 million to $8 million cost. There's a minimum cost associated with water treatment is where I'm going. And you know, for some of our communities, there's no break-even point. But we need to do it because it's our legislated obligation and to protect public health. You know, your greater economies of scale with a large water treatment plant and, you know, 160,000 service connections within the Woodward system, there's going to be a lower cost per treated liter of water or cubic meter of water, despite all the additional infrastructure.
Thanks, Senior Director. No more questions. I hope I'm the last person.
You were for first-time speakers. And next up, we have Councillor Maureen Wilson as our second-time speaker. Thank you.
So I apologize to Councillor Caddison. Just a single question because you've raised it. Nick, if you could educate me, has Council in recent memory received a report on the delisting process and progress and the quantum of investments and by whom that would need to be made in order to achieve that?
So through you, Chair Nan. So I'd have to refresh myself on the content of a report that we brought to General Issues Committee. It was in March of last year, so March of 2022. We had Kristen O'Connor with HH-RAP come in as part of that meeting, and she spoke to the delisting process. And I forget exactly what details we provided in our report. It was an update on Shadow Creek, that part of that report. But I know Kristen did mention that we're waiting for the Woodward upgrade program to be completed, the full construction on the tertiary treatment process. And that's going to be the starting point for a period of time where we're looking at, we as a community are looking at how the water quality in Hamilton Harbor responds to that significant reduction in pollution loadings on an ongoing basis. But there's no set timeline to say, 5 years after this new facility is commissioned that we're now going to be at a point where we can approach delisting. It's really at that point in time, we're looking at the response from the environment to say, when is that environment returning to a state of health that pursuing that delisting can actually occur. I hope that answers the question. I will add on, sorry. We are bringing a report either in May or June to Public Works Committee that speaks to the completion of that Woodward upgrade program. And there'll be a presentation accompanying that, and it is going to speak to the performance of that new tertiary treatment facility based on real data over the past 6 months and spell out that environmental impact for us as well.
Thank you, Councillor.
Yep, thank you very much. I had forgotten about Kristen being here, and I appreciate that poke, and I'll go back and read that report. If I could get a comment from you through the chair to Director Winter, the relationship between a watershed approach and the sort of philosophy that may have been guiding the city's work in it before that. So the way I had maybe incorrectly understood it to be is that we really need to take a watershed approach to all manner of water quality, because instead of looking at or in addition to looking at the health of our harbor and of Coots and even our urban streams, we have to go from perhaps the tailpipe to the engine, meaning a greater appreciation of the activities, land use activities, agricultural activities, industrial activities that are often happening far at a distance from the tailpipes or our headwaters and the like. And if I could just ask you to confirm whether I have that correct. I may not. And secondly, your understanding of how that shift is going. I guess I'm anxious to understand learning more about our activities with respect to the watershed planning approach and when we'll be learning more about that. Thank you.
So through you, Chair Nan, I wish I had Director Vanderberg here to assist me with this, but I will do my best. So the Watershed Action Plan is looking at the non-point source pollutant loadings that are being received within the within Hamilton Harbour, Cootes Paradise, Red Hill Creek, but all of our watersheds. And identifying opportunities to control those non-source pollutants. And I'd say, so a point source pollutant, for example, the discharge from a wastewater treatment plant. We know it's there, we quantify it on an ongoing basis, and we've got programs in place now to deal with that point source pollutant. The other major point source pollutant historically in Hamilton Harbour was Randall Reef, which is now contained. So now we're looking at those non-point source pollutant loadings, be it agricultural runoff to Spencer Creek, or down to runoff from fertilizer use within neighborhoods on Hamilton Mountain, where that stormwater is making its way down through the waterfalls and into Chouteau Creek watershed or Red Hill Creek watershed. It's getting to that point of what are the contributors now that we should be focusing on, and in priority as well. And we have to recognize the scope of municipal authority as well as the authority of our partners based on the identification of those. So that's happening. The Watershed Action Plan is also looking at, as you mentioned, land use planning, asking the questions of what is the benefit of installing a pipe where there's an existing open water course, for example? What benefits are we losing by having that opportunity for stormwater infiltration and pollutant reduction by running through a natural water course? And so, but I mentioned the 3 EAs, so I won't repeat them, but both of those items are being investigated as part of 2 of the different EAs.
Yeah, no, I apologize to my colleagues. I understand this is about drinking water, and I know we all know the interconnectedness, so I will end my questions there, and I know we'll have a future opportunity to delve into these. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Councillor Wilson. That exhausts our speakers list. Thank you again to staff for the presentation on drinking water, but also speaking to so many of the questions that do lend themselves because of the interconnected nature of our water and drinking water. So it's been moved and seconded. At this point, we need to receive the presentation, please.
So, sorry, Chair Nan, through you, if I may. I know we got into topics about drinking water and stormwater as well. We do have about 10 slides where we're going to walk committee through the legal obligations associated with wastewater and stormwater. Would be relatively short if you want to see that part of the presentation. And if you're not interested, then we're okay with that too.
Now? Sorry. Sorry that I sound surprised.
Yes, we do have them. And I'd mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that we go through drinking water first. I know we took questions on both, but we do have those slides that should committee wish to see them.
Fair. So how about we just first let's receive, since it's been moved and seconded, the presentation we have received thus far. And then I'll scan my colleagues and see if you're interested in those additional 10 slides. I'll treat that as a separate report. Thanks. Or a separate presentation. My apologies. Has everybody had a chance to indicate their vote?
I don't know how to share. He's controlling it up there.
And that carries. Thank you, colleagues. Are committee members interested in the secondary presentation? That could get an indication, and I apologize, I can't see folks in the chambers.
Stop sharing that because you can't see it now.
Oh. I'm looking to you clerks to confirm.
There's 3 out of the 4 in the chamber that would like to see the presentation.
Great, thank you. I am going to have to ask to pass the chair role on. I had a commitment at noon that I was able to move back a little bit. So if I could pass the chair on and I'll have to give my regrets for missing this portion of the presentation. So either to previous Deputy Mayor Danko. Thank you, appreciate it.
No problem, Councillor. So Director Winters, I believe you have part B. Go ahead when you're ready.
Okay, we will continue.
And would you like me to start with the introduction, Nick?
Please, Sue. Wendy's going to control us here because I guess I'm hopeless.
Okay. Okay, so as with the wastewater systems, there is no standard of care training required for let's get to the right one. Okay, while there's no standard of care training required for wastewater, we'd like to take this time with you to review the requirements of council for due diligence. As you are aware, the City of Hamilton created our own voluntary wastewater quality management system standard. The Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks is interested in creating a voluntary wastewater QMS standard and has been working with the CSA to develop a voluntary standard. Hamilton Water has contributed funds and offered subject matter expert staff to develop this initiative. At this time, the CSA is presently on hold. In this next slide, Director Winters will provide you with an overview of the wastewater system.
Thank you, Susan. So just very quickly, I included this slide in the 2023 water, wastewater, and stormwater rate budget presentation, just to highlight the scope of the city's wastewater infrastructure and some of the supporting programs. For the sake of today's discussion, I'm simply going to mention that the city has 2 wastewater treatment plants, Woodward and Dundas, 9 combined sewer overflow tanks, 71 wastewater pumping stations, more than 1,800 kilometers of sanitary and combined sewers, and more than 48,000 maintenance access chambers. And now I'm going to pass this over to Wendy.
So when we were talking about drinking water, we were talking a lot about the Safe Drinking Water Act. And when we're talking about wastewater, we look at legislation that is in place to protect the natural environment. And this legislation is at both the provincial and, as Nick mentioned earlier, at the federal level, as well as our municipal sewer use bylaw. As Susan mentioned, we do have a wastewater QMS, and this wastewater QMS standard was developed in-house by Hamilton Water, and we developed and implemented it because it was the right thing to do. Unlike DW QMS, the wastewater QMS was not mandated by the province. This standard is based on Environmental Management System Standard ISO 14001 and built upon the great framework we had in place for the DW QMS standard. And similar to the DW QMS, we have a wastewater QMS policy. The policy for this is clean. So the C is complying with legislation, leaders in pollution prevention, effective communication, always improving, and noteworthy innovation. And it's of note that we held a contest in Hamilton Water to come up with this policy poster acronym. And another thing of note is that this policy was recently posted in the hallway across from the councillor's lunchroom. So if you're swinging by there today, you'll be able to see that. It was just installed yesterday. And this one, these terminologies or these roles and responsibilities will be similar. You've seen them before, and they're exactly the same as our drinking water QMS. And back over to you, Nick.
Thank you. So again, just a slide that speaks to some of the challenges that we're working on with our wastewater systems. And committee has heard about all of these previously. Just a reminder, we are under orders from the MECP resulting from the Chedoke Creek discharge event. We've already spoken about it here today. And those orders include required actions both for Chedoke Creek and Cootes Paradise. And committee will be receiving an update on the Chedoke Creek project at the March 22nd General Issues Committee meeting, so in a little less than a month. We're also under orders from the ministry resulting from the Burlington Street and Rutherford Avenue sewage spills resulting from cross-connected city sewer pipes. We've spoken about a little bit. And we provided a report and presentation to Public Works Committee on February 13th with an update on those matters. I know that committee is aware that Hamilton has the third oldest wastewater system in Canada, and that includes a extensive combined sewer system. We've talked about it again here today already. And I know you're aware that the most visible challenge related to a combined sewer system are combined sewer overflows as well as wastewater treatment plant bypasses that unfortunately occur here during wet weather. During the 2023 water wastewater storm rate budget process, I did speak to committee about the poor condition of the Dundas wastewater treatment plant and the need to prioritize its replacement in the near future. And Public Works Committee can expect to receive a report on options for the Dundas wastewater treatment facility later in 2023. And I also spoke during the budget process about extensive emergency repairs to one of the digester tanks at the Woodward wastewater treatment plant. And I mention it, one, because it was an expensive endeavor, but two, because it speaks as an unfortunate example of what can happen when we don't renew or replace our infrastructure in a timely manner. We're left with an expensive emergency, which is not the best value for our community from a dollar for infrastructure perspective. And finally, during the budget process, I spoke to committee about the changing regulatory framework for municipal wastewater approvals within Ontario, and that given the unique characteristics of Hamilton's wastewater collection system, that could lead to delays in approvals for new developments that are adding new wastewater flow through the city's combined sewer system. And that's something that we're continuing to work with the ministry on presently. We expect to see new environmental compliance approvals for our systems in place. We're hearing by the end of June, and we'll know at that point in time if we were successful in controlling that risk from a delayed development approvals perspective or not. So now it's back to Sue, and we're going to speak briefly about stormwater.
Oh, rookie mistake, sorry. As with the wastewater systems, there is no standard of care training required for stormwater, but we want to take this opportunity to provide you with an overview of your responsibilities. There is no stormwater quality management system. However, there are many elements of the drinking water quality management system and the wastewater QMS that are utilized to maintain compliance with the stormwater legislation. For example, we utilize document control, record control, roles and responsibilities and authorities, and training, to name a few. In the next slide, Nick will provide you with an overview of the stormwater system.
Thank you, Susan. And so similar to the wastewater slide, we included this slide in our budget presentation for 2023. And it speaks to the scope of our stormwater infrastructure and supporting programs. So just to follow the same track as wastewater, we currently have more than 120 stormwater ponds that Hamilton Water is responsible for maintaining and monitoring. We have two stormwater pumping stations, almost 1,300 kilometers of separated stormwater pipes, 148 kilometers of water courses, 57 kilometers of municipal drains. And in 2022, we've talked about it a little bit, but Hamilton Water responded to more than 486 spill calls, each of which could have resulted in contaminants impacting the natural environment. Back to Wendy.
Susan mentioned that we do not have a stormwater quality management system in place. However, we do take those roles and responsibilities for the operator and the operating authority and the owner. We do apply that to all of our internal procedures, and it's those key roles and responsibilities carry through. And that's back over to Nick.
All right, this is our last slide, and it speaks to some challenges with our stormwater system. First, I wanted to mention that we do have a very successful program in Hamilton for the investigation, confirmation, and repair of private sewer laterals that are connected to the wrong sewer pipes. In early 2023, we will be surpassing 500 sewer lateral cross-connection repairs, which will have eliminated more than 110 million litres of sewage discharged to the natural environment annually. And that's over the course of that program. We've talked about the city's watershed action plan, which is evaluating opportunities and programs to mitigate nutrients entering our waterways from stormwater runoff. And I mentioned that committee can look forward to hearing more about those programs in the future. Another one of our challenges is that we have different levels of service across the city for the correct collection and removal of stormwater. And we've spoken to committee about that previously. And what it means is that a rain event in one area of the city could have no visible impact. But if we get that same rain event in a different area of the city, we could see that there's roadway or potentially even property flooding. And that has to do with the growth of our system and the age of our system. In order to better analyze those types of risks, Hamilton Water is in the early stages of a multi-year initiative to improve our stormwater system hydraulic models. And the last bullet on this slide also speaks to the flooding and drainage improvement framework, which we presented to committee in fall of 2022. And that framework charts a path to mitigating those flooding risks in the future, using sewer separation as a tactic and also other interventions. And just to remind committee, we are kicking off 3 environmental assessments in 2023 related to the flooding and drainage improvement framework, and those are looking at larger infrastructure needs that would be required to take separated stormwater if we go through and separate areas of the sewer system and take that stormwater to an outlet to the natural environment. We're also in the process of catching up on our stormwater pond maintenance programs. We've spoken to committee about that before. And while we're making good progress, we still are a few years away from eliminating the backlog of that maintenance program. In 2023, we're beginning work in earnest on the development of a downspout disconnection program for the city, which has historically been missing. And so we've got money from the provincial government that's supporting the development of a robust downspout disconnection program. In 2023, Public Works Committee will also receive a report and presentation regarding enhancements to the city's municipal drain program, which is another program that historically hasn't been moved forward due to lack of resources and other priorities. But we are at a point where we can start to move that forward, and we'll tell committee what that will look like. And finally on this slide, 2 things. One, committee is aware of the work that's being led by corporate finance to transition towards a dedicated stormwater rate. And we know there's a report coming to General Issues Committee in Q2 of this year regarding the next steps on that journey. And then during the 2023 water, wastewater, stormwater budget process, I did speak about the future need for a stormwater monitoring and enforcement program. And that program would make sure that private stormwater controls, so installed and maintained on private property, are being maintained and operated appropriately to minimize impacts to the city's stormwater and combined sewer system. And development of that program will start in 2023, although we have had to reprioritize a little bit because the same staff who are going to lead the development of that program have been responding to the MECP orders resulting from the Burlington Street and Rutherford Avenue sewage spills. So we're moving a little slower on that than planned. So that is it for stormwater. I don't know if we generated any questions that haven't already been asked, but if so, we're happy to address them.
Thank you, Director Winters and your team. I don't see any indications in the chat. I'm not sure if there's any in chambers. Maybe clerks can help me survey if there's any discussion.
No, there are no speakers in the council chamber either.
Okay, thank you. I guess I need a motion to receive then.
Yes, please.
Councillor Wilson, A. Wilson, seconded by Councillor Wang. All in favor or opposed? And I assume that carries, but just let me know.
Councillor McMeekin, we need your vote. Thumbs up. Councillor Wilson, M. Wilson, we need your vote. Thank you. Councillor Spatafora, not there. And Councillor Jackson is not there.
That's unanimous. Thank you. And
Yes.
I think lastly is a motion to adjourn, clerk.
That would be the next item.
Okay, motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Wang, seconded by Councillor M. Wilson. All in favor or opposed? And that is unanimous. Thank you. See you tomorrow.